Hi, and welcome to the New Models of Democracy panel. Unfortunately, the audio for the first 3 minutes and 14 seconds of this recording were not captured, and so I've been asked to re-record the introduction. My name is Dion McCurdy. I'm the CEO and co-founder of NewVote, as well as an adjunct associate lecturer at the University of Queensland in the School of Political Science. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and acknowledge their leaders, both past, present and emerging. So, here we are in May 2019, just 2 weeks shy of our Federation's 45th general election. We in Australia are lucky and should be proud of our democratic systems, at least in comparison to other nations on Earth at this time. But even here, the disconnect between our elected representatives and the rest of the citizens in our society is profound. Democracy is at a crossroads, one that can literally be graphed in a chart. Year on year, the number of people that vote at elections continues to grow. We're a long way from the crisis of 1941, a low point in history when only 11 democracies existed. Today, 97 out of the 169 countries on Earth are democracies. That's 58%. But every year, our trust in government as an institution continues to fall. We're talking record lows throughout much of the world. What do we make of this? What do we do about this? People overwhelmingly blame democracy, and I tend to agree with them, but I would be specific. The system of democratic governance we use, representative democracy, has failed us. We need to acknowledge this as not a failing of any one party or politician. Most of them mean well. It's a failing of the system. The failing is an inability to adapt to the modern world, to utilize the technology we have today to harness the skills, knowledge, and experiences of our peers. It's a failure to learn from our history and to deploy the other democratic governance models at our disposal, whether that be direct democracy, that is voting directly on issues, or deliberative democracy, and specifically the gold standard citizen juries. I think in our haste and in our surrender to the system that we know is failing us, we are perhaps moving towards authoritarianism the wrong way. What we need to do is redefine what democracy is. No small task. But tonight is an excellent opportunity to share. Tonight we'll hear from 5 experts on democracy and 5 minor parties contesting the next election. From the experts, you can expect to hear various aspects of democracy and models that could be adopted to help make the Australian government system more representative of the will of its people. The parties here tonight will share their democratic innovations. I don't really have anything further to add from the introductory. I'll start actually, as I'm the first speaker, with NewVote. Is everyone happy with that? Okay. So, yeah, I'll get to it. Yeah. It's a bit of a mouthful, but NewVote is a non-profit, a for-purpose, registered charity, approved research institute, technology startup. Our purpose is about advancing education and enhancing democracy, and the main way that we do that is through a democracy app, which is a direct link between people and their leaders. So this can be applied to a classroom or a school or your university or your union or your business or your political party or your festival. It's available to our local jurisdictions, to our state jurisdictions, and to our federal jurisdictions. What sets NewVote apart is that we are issues focused, that we are solutions focused, and that we're action orientated. And that's exactly the structure that the NewVote platform takes. It's a grassroots platform, so anybody can add to it. And, well, we're a startup. I think I said that before. It means that we have put out a beta into the ecosystem. We currently have 12 communities with 550 or so members. That's not any indication of how it's going to go, because we've signed, as of last week or 2 weeks ago, a memorandum of understanding with the University of Queensland Student Union for them to use NewVote as the official engagement software between themselves and the students. And that will start on the 1st of July. It'll be a 12-month pilot. And, well, we're not stopping there. There's a lot of other communities that we're growing and hope to get some good numbers. The kind of theory is that essentially we need to start local, and we need to learn how to use these tools. We need to learn that there is a system between essentially a feedback loop that's required. We need to be able to get, in my opinion, to our phones and learn about political issues, discuss them, ask questions, share opinions, share what is the best way to address these issues. And we need to actually see our leaders listening to that. There are plenty of platforms where people have their say. We want to be a platform where people are listened to and they see real actions in the real world. And then people see that there's actually the possibility that they can use technology to do this. So I'll just take you on a little tour, just so you get an idea. It's, can I? Yeah. Which tab am I looking at? Oh, do I have to go? Yeah, okay, fair enough. So this is UQ's version. It's got, the background cover photo, logo, byline. It has issues, and these are sort of, the kind of hot topics at UQ at the moment. You can see the number of members and the issues and solutions on the platform. That number is not actually accurate. It should be about 210 by now. It just happens that we had to rewrite the front end, and that figure doesn't include the people who joined us first off. And this is sort of almost in abeyance at the moment, as I'm working with UQ on upgrades and them really actively taking a role with it. And then there's a bit of explanation essentially about what NewVote is and how to create an account, and our model, which is issues, solutions, and it says proposals. I'm going to rename that to actions. We'll click on an issue. And so this is a web-based app. We don't have a native app yet, but it shapes to the size of any screen. And, so it feels and looks like a mobile app if you happen to be looking at it on your mobile. So we've got a cover photo again, social sharing, the title, the tags, which are essentially the topics that this issue might fall under. We have an information summary essentially that the leader can put in. One day we want them to make that a publicly editable wiki. And we have these third-party resources here, so crowd-generated and crowd-rated, anything really, a URL. So it could be the minutes of last week's meeting, or it could be newspaper articles, or it could be the IPCC report. So that sort of gives the user the ability to sort of verify the facts and the information summary. And then there are solutions. So this is a solution. UQ should be developed, the UQU complex, and people are able to vote. I've only added this issue literally, a week or so ago, so there aren't many votes there right now. That's the general layout. In terms of people making contributions, they can click on suggestions, and it's very rudimentary, but people are able to, once they've created an account, there's a button that shows here that says make a suggestion. And the leaders are able to respond to that and then essentially move the content over to where it's meant to be, to issues, solutions, or actions. So you can see here I've said, hey, thanks for the suggestion. I've added this as a solution for this issue with the little hyperlink. It said Dion for NewVote. So that's what we got today. But NewVote has a lot of things going on. There is a lot of, it's a complex task to be a startup. And I'm sure it's something that everybody here, or almost everybody here, can relate to. working with startups or starting up political parties. I definitely come at this with a view towards collaboration. I think that we don't need to keep reinventing the wheel, and we can start to work together. Then we can start to get some real wins. So prior to the New South Wales federal election, Flux party adopted NewVote, as essentially, an experiment, which is lovely to see. We need to see experiments, because we'll either learn some good stuff or we'll see some success. And I don't know for sure, but I understand they might be using it for this federal election. The point is that we're essentially a software company, and we're a non-partisan independent software company. So we'll be happy to work with any political party, any community that you might have, and it can be used as a direct way to sort of source ideas from the people, see how they're feeling while they remain anonymous. In some ways, what we're doing is kind of redefining the relationship between people and leaders. And so the Woodford Folk Festival has decided to use it because they have a Woodfordia citizens concept, and people with a great deal of love for Woodford contribute a lot, and they also want to contribute and be heard, when they have views that matter and when they have solutions to problems. So we're going to roll that out over the period of time as well. I would like to ask, does anybody have any questions about NewVote? Because, look, I'm a little bit nervous, unfortunately, right now. I've got to shake it out or something, but I could talk about NewVote for literally hours, so maybe it's best to just hear what you guys wanted to know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, they were developing it, certainly, and it's a blockchain-based software. It hasn't been released, and yeah, I suppose so. I mean, the guys that founded Flux, Max and Nathan, lovely guys, also spun off their technology to Secure Vote, sort of a private company that develops the software, and they also have other pursuits, and I'm sure a lot of you can resonate with the concept of having to have a day job and doing these things in your passion. So they've got a big network. They've got over 8,000 members as far as I'm aware. So and they've got a good kind of thing going. I'll be honest with you, the thing that I feel that all direct democracy parties have failed to do, in Australia at least, is actually put some software out there with their community, start to get that feedback, that hard feedback, learn, iterate, and actually build something that people can use, so that when an election comes around, it's not just, oh, we will build it, we'll build it, trust us, everything's going to work out great. But they've actually put it out there and learnt and actually have something that is great, that is working. And so, yeah, that's my answer to that question. Yeah.
A question in terms of, it's a really good answer and a really good way to open this, Dion. I very much appreciate that. As a question on the back of that in terms of buy-in to this, because I think that's a really important aspect of modern democracy. Do you think that has to do with chain of custody in terms of voting packets, if I can put it that way? Whether that's to do with awareness from the public, or whether this is some form of antipathy or fear from larger political parties in relation to using technology as a tool for democracy and a more direct form of democracy? And I don't know whether the microphone was turned on.
No, probably not. Okay. Oh, you were? No. Okay, so the question was around the issues of a lack of public buy-in, or is it a matter that the major parties don't want to buy in? Is that a fear of buying in? Yeah. Well, I think there's both. Nobody has actually cracked it. Nobody's put to the public. The question, you can just tell him.
I've chosen aspects to it. One is the strictly legal side, and that's the chain of custody of packets, voting packets, if I can put it that way. Yeah. And whether that's considered to be a truly immutable process. Testing. For voting. Secondly, whether it's people's awareness of such systems, and whether that's an issue in terms of a direct form of democracy through technology. Or the third sort of tier or element of the question
Yeah, well, I guess the answer to the first question is essentially around security. And I think that that is amplified when we're talking about electronic voting, which means, replacing paper ballot with some sort of electronic solution. Personally, I care not for that whatsoever. You can continue to have paper ballots as much as you want. What I want people to do is start looking at issues. What I want people to do is deliberate. And so whether you end up taking 5 years or 50 years to replace the paper ballot, it doesn't really matter, as long as when it does so, there's a consensus that it is secure enough. On the second question, buy-in, that's the answer is about that we really haven't cracked it. No democracy app, sorry, everyone including my own, is really that mainstream, sticky yet, that it doesn't really have the depth that people are looking for. I've scanned the internet over the past couple of years, and there are many corpses in the direct and digital democracy world, many attempts, and many people going back to their regular jobs afterwards. And even right now, I will continue to learn every month of a new website or a new, coin offering and so on. It's not really the problem that people, a lack of ideas. It's I think a lack of execution, and really perhaps learning from the apps that are popular and bringing your ideas around democracy into that kind of measure. It won't work if you're asking people to learn an entirely complex and new system. They want to do that. What they want to do is just participate, and learn and be part of the decision-making process, have their voice heard. And I think the third part was about the fear of the major parties. There's a reluctance, certainly, because representative democracy provides a great deal of power and authority and scope to political parties. And, in most of the Western world, two parties essentially rule, two-party system. It doesn't have to be that way, but it just is that way, and that reduces the scope of choice even more. And so essentially what you have is that 5% of the population that are, in political science terms, political elites, and they are spread across the parties. There's probably everyone in this room that knows a thing about politics is actually in the minority, but or at least has the interest in turning up to an event like this. But yeah, we have a plan in place to get the parties engaged with what we're doing. One of them is that we have a governing working group at the moment, which will eventually be a governing council, and that includes representatives from all, the political spectrum. At the moment, it has a former LNP party president and a former Speaker of the House for the Labor Party. So, and in doing that, we want to, well, there's two things about it. Firstly, people looking at NewVote don't think, okay, this is a left or a right-wing conspiracy, based on the people that are on the board and all that kind of stuff. They'll see there's a spread, and they'll see that there's someone that they trust who sort of sits within their sort of their value system, and they'll say that person wouldn't get involved unless this is for real. And the other thing is that those representatives can then go to their party and say, this is an opportunity, this isn't a threat. We're mad if we don't get onto this, because they might just do it before us. But then there's also the pressure coming from down below. So if we get this successful at the University of Queensland with 52,000 students, and we spread that, I'm meeting with the QUT Student Guild next week. And if we can spread that to a few different universities, learn from the different environments, almost A/B testing, as well as the festivals, as well as the NGOs that I'm working with. There's a local councillor that wants to get involved. There is a lot of interest in this, and if we just build it up from the lowest level, where the people are actually closest to their leader, and where they can actually sort of ensure that their will is being performed, then that will build trust in that cycle I was talking about before, that there's accomplishments are actually happening. And that's how you sell yourself. There's a lot, unfortunately, of people in this sphere who are a little bit all about marketing and not really, they're telling and not showing. And at NewVote, I think we remain pretty modest in what the work that we've done is still pretty impressive. but we prefer to show, which is why I show you this rather than trying to take it, you know, to extreme levels. Any other questions? Yes?
I was just wondering,
I don't think it works.
hello.
Oh yeah, it's there.
I was just wondering, in developing some political parties, say, whole websites and other things that have been tried in the past to engage public and get public opinion. Some of it's voting, some of it's ranking of issues, all that stuff. None of which have just seemed to really catch on at all. But I presume you're aware of those and researched those and looked at what's been tried before as part of doing this. What's your feeling about why they haven't caught on and what's different about this?
Well, I mean, are you talking about the online community engagement platforms that are regularly employed by local councils and utility companies, things like Our Say and Bang the Table, or are you, what kind of?
A few different ones, I guess, and I'm not really hugely. I mean, I've seen a few over the years and sort of dabbled a tiny bit, and you can tell pretty quickly they're just because you've got to get a critical mass, I guess, is the key thing for this.
We're all faced with the chicken and the egg problem here. You know, it won't work until people use it, and people won't use it until it works. And that's why the plan is to simply start at a small place where it works. And so the University of Queensland Student Union says, we are actively going to use this, we are going to listen to the responses, and they actually perform some of those actions that have been asked of them by the people, then that's going to be the buy-in, and those people are going to spread the word. I imagine a future, basically, where you would have a NewVote app, and you simply click into it, and you'd have your school there, and you'd have your neighbourhood, and you'd have your PNC group, you'd have your work there, you would have your union there, you would have your local, state, and federal member there, maybe some sort of international levels as well. And it's essentially a central place where you can find those issues.
There was one, sorry to interrupt, I might have the name wrong, it's a few years back now, but I think it was called Town Hall or something. It was a web-based thing, and a number of individual politicians and councils used it, and it sort of looked like it could be okay in theory, and it had a few different variations, not just a straight-up vote, but a bit of a ranking or prioritising and stuff. But again, it just, I guess, critical mass, but the idea seemed sound enough from my little bit of dabbling in it.
Yeah, well, the founder, Karen Flavel, I think it is, I spoke to her about a month ago, and she told me, the story of Town Hall was that they were doing reasonably well here in Australia. They were up there basically competing with Our Say, and they went over to the US to base themselves there, and their model was to try and get newspaper companies to pay them for them to ask questions of people. The model didn't work, and they've given up on the project, and that's what's happened with Town Hall. It happens a lot. I mean, Our Say, for example, and Bang the Table, these are very successful. But these companies are essentially still top-down. They're given strict parameters by the politicians, by the governments and the utilities that employ them. They say, we only talk about these issues. We only want these kind of responses. And it is that, the level of trust is so low in these institutions. Nobody bothers to participate because they know it's not real. That somebody is ticking a box that says community engagement, but that the results of what actually comes out are, really secondary to the decisions that they're making. And so, Brisbane recently did a build your backyard or something like that. Does anybody remember that? They made a game, and you could place houses and parks and so on. Yeah, well, I mean, they had about 4,000 responses in a town of 2 million people. I mean, because everybody knew it was going nowhere. Look, I could talk forever, and I appreciate your time, and I won't unfortunately be able to talk to you each after the session. I'll have to leave after the break, but grab me then if you'd like to ask any questions. So next, I should probably know who the next person is that's speaking. Miles, can you inform me? I think it might be Frank Miles.
Dr. Ball, are you ready? I am ready.
Yeah, come over. So Frank Moz is a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland. He's particularly, his speciality is in social identity, social identity theory. Okay, well, I'll leave it to you. I'm very curious to see what you're going to do.
Yeah. Did you get the presentation? Oh, that's just loading up, yeah. That's the one. Sorry? Stand on the carpet. Are you recording this, are you? Jeez, I was hoping it wasn't going to be recorded. Yeah, that's right. It's going to be more about yeah, exactly. No, it's not, I'm sure. Yeah. I can try my stand-up comedy. No, actually don't want to hear that. Did you hear about the politician? Yeah, that's right. Is that the one who died last century? What did you use? What curiosity? What do you use? Okay. Look, I'm old-fashioned. I still use PowerPoint. And yes, we've got something on the screen. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you for having me, the organizers. When Dion asked me to present something here on political psychology and social identity theory, I thought social identity theory is too specific. I'm going to make some broader political psychology observations about what you guys are doing, I think. It's a bit of a work in progress because I wasn't sure whether the things I had in mind would be of interest to you. So if not, then hopefully we can have a good discussion afterwards around the things I've been talking, and perhaps things I haven't been talking about. Is there a clicker or...
Sorry, say when.
Yep, when, say when. Right, so I think let me begin with a couple of trends that you're very well aware of. First of all, we've got the rise of minor parties, not just in Australia, but in Western Europe and many other parts of the world, which is noted now by most observers and become a study object, of course. What does that signify? I think voters are really craving change, but they're not quite sure what the change is. So the vote is often going to parties that offer some promise of change, and that can be radical left or radical right, but there's an element of uncertainty what these parties would really offer if they were to come to power. So there's a lot of talk around voter, or there has been a lot of talk around voter disengagement in recent years, voter apathy, people don't care anymore, and so forth. So one thing is of note here is probably to say that there's in a sense also a re-engagement. The whole populist surge and the rise of minor party is in a weird way also a resurgence of interest and vigor and interest in the political process, although badly managed and badly channeled into all sorts of crazy parties, at least in my view. But nonetheless, there is a form of engagement. So I think from that perspective, we could be here in a window of opportunity. At the moment, these opportunities, it seems, are seized by opportunistic leaders who harness these kinds of sentiments for the wrong reasons. But at the same time, maybe it's good to stand still, and this is maybe a good time to start harnessing these sentiments for better purposes. Yes. So it seems that leaders and followers, broadly speaking, are, as it were, caught in a vicious cycle, trapped in a vicious cycle. Oh, I hadn't realized that the lines would come up. I was happy for them to come up all together. So, of course, voters complain bitterly about politicians. Yet, come election time, they become very enthusiastic followers, and they'll do anything to back their opponent and to slag off the opponent. Likewise, voters complain bitterly about mudslinging and negativity, yet they're happy to take part in it online, especially the ones who have become part of a party. The other thing is, of course, that any leader who is elected and promises us that he or she will be different. This time it's going to be different. I'm going to stand in Canberra and I'm going to be the civic leader. That usually takes a couple of days. I can distinctly remember Kevin Rudd making noises along those lines. It didn't take much before he was into the routine of shouting and throwing obscenities almost across the aisle. Yes? Right. So that leads me to the question. I think I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate here tonight, because I'm in the vicinity here of people who have put a lot of faith in new technology to fix these very old problems. And I think I overheard somebody earlier asking a question that sort of echoes the same sentiment, namely that the age-old dream of depoliticizing politics is, of course, incredibly old, and it comes up in waves. For example, think of the 1950s when IT technology came of age. There was a surge of interest combined with the behavioral revolution, the social science, this idea that finally we would be able to depoliticize policy issues, finally come to objective truth, and finally have solutions for complex problems. But that was, of course, hopelessly naive. And we see a similar kind of surge in the 1990s, driven by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the United Kingdom, this move towards evidence-based policy making, this idea that if we set aside values and beliefs and politics, we should be able to come to evidence-based policies. And in both instances, the conclusions always trickle down to the end, to the same endpoint, that we can't set aside values and belief systems, that we are inherently political animals, that we have different worldviews and belief systems. Think of an example as religion, right? Whether abortion should be legalized or not is, of course, not just a matter of scientific evidence that's inherently bound up with people's beliefs and values. So I think it's important in a venue here, like here today, to remind ourselves that we may not want to repeat the same mistakes of the past and not have that naivety of thinking that technology will cut through value problems. But that isn't to say that we should be hopeless or despair. I think it's a good aspiration to depoliticize, right? So we should not lose that aspiration to do it, but we should do it with full awareness of where we've been at the past. Yes? So, yes? Yeah, it depends a bit on the time, I guess, if we have time for... Yeah, shall we do questions in the end? Is that okay? So it's also not bad maybe to think back in terms of what we know already historically. We've had, of course, people as far back as Aristotle who thought about politics and good governance and leadership. What he wrote about, and others, is about the characteristics also about effective persuasion, communication. And he came up with this idea of ethos, pathos, logos, which you in all likelihood have heard of, that persuasive communication has to contain these three ingredients. It has to come from a trusted source, it has to appeal to emotion, and it has to be sound logic, sound reasoning. And for him, this was the combination of characteristics of persuasive rhetoric. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Can we go to the next slide? So while that is a very good beginning, others have done some really interesting additional work in terms of politics and persuasion, and how do we end up with persistent problems. And worthwhile naming here is David Hume, who is one of the first ones to acknowledge that we're rational human beings, but also to draw attention that we're fabulous as human beings at self-delusion and at ex post rationalization. To my knowledge, he's one of the first Western thinkers who actually writes about that, but I'm pretty sure that there's always going to be somebody else who's written about it before him. That insight that we are effectively very good at ex post rationalization comes back in contemporary political psychology and social psychology research. For example, we have Kunda's work on motivated reasoning, according to which if we lean in a certain direction emotionally, we already are sort of predisposed to post-rationalize, to rationalize towards that emotional position. Motivated reasoning. The same idea is developed by Jonathan Haidt in a more recent book in 2012 called The Righteous Mind, also pointing in the same tradition that moral judgments are typically emotional first and rationalized later. And here, a little bit of social identity theory, as Dion promised. This is also the tradition in which my work is located, in this idea that we tend to overestimate rational arguments and particularly cost-benefit analyses and cost-benefit assessments, and forget that in fact the emotional drivers, particularly tribal drivers, are far more influential in policy and in political decision-making and in voting behavior in particular. So the contribution by John Turner and others is that persuasion, the pathway to persuasion is actually via social identification. So it's a shared sense of social identification that allows us to persuade others or be persuaded by others. That's quite a lot, and I'm happy to give another lecture another day on that particular topic, but that follows in the tradition that says emotion comes first, reason comes later. Yes? Could we go to the next? Another one? I'm not sure what happened there. The slide doesn't come up. So fast forward to the current malaise, if you like. What are we dealing with at the moment? I think we're currently, and the rise of the minor party is, I think, a symptom of that, dealing with the crisis of mainstream party leadership. I think that's a lot to be accounts for that a lot. So what do we see, broadly speaking, is ideological convergence in the mainstream parties, voters therefore rightfully feeling that there's not much difference between the two main parties to choose from. There's strategic pandering to populism, trying to avoid voters from particularly the Conservative Party or the Liberal parties to move across to far-right parties or radical right parties. That's going on as well. But because of that convergence, what we see is that the party leaders often have to step up the rhetoric of difference, us, them, even though the policy difference is really much more tiny than the rhetoric would suggest. And this aggressive othering not only triggers tribalism, or as Jonathan Haidt described it, the tribal switch, or the beehive switch, to be precise, as he describes it. It also encourages partisan groupthink. And I'm pretty sure that most of you would be familiar with the idea of groupthink, right? The idea that once we're in a group, we start to converge to the same position, we do not like to dissent, and I've got a few more words on that on the next slide. Could we go to the next slide? So once the tribal vote is switched, we become a little bit more like these sheep. What does that mean in terms of party politics? Because groupthinkers actually developed the concept in organizational psychology to study decision-making behavior in organizations, but I think it translates across quite nicely to party politics as well. Because what happens is that once people become tribal, there's a sense that you have to buy into the whole package. You cannot just be an X-voter and only do X1, but not X2 and X3. You have to become part of the whole suite of opinions. Anyone who is not, is saying, I'm only buying into X1, but not X2 and X3, is immediately punished sometimes by the fellow party members by saying you're not a genuine supporter. Right? So it's hard to be a critical party member, if you like. So there's an element of censoring others, but also self-censoring. Am I part of this mob? Right? Do I belong? Yes, could we go on? Yeah. So once the tribal switch is triggered, dissent becomes difficult. Members send each other. Okay, I've pretty much gone through this already, I think. Those who do buy into the whole package will often also rise through the ranks and become held in higher regard because you're bought into the whole gospel and you can stand up anywhere and will make it. And this is actually quite toxic, I think, for political parties. Parties should actually avoid this tooth and nail and fight it tooth and nail because the best parties are the ones that are dynamic with this internal criticism, and internal criticism can be allowed. Sometimes what you see is, particularly the Liberal Party has a tendency to do that. If there is some disagreement, oh, but Minister X said that, and well, we're a broad church and we allow diversity here, that this is the Liberal Party for you, right? But it's actually not a deeply felt commitment to diversity or dissenting voices. Minor parties, in my view, can also fall victim to that. right? I've dealt with a couple of minor parties locally and nationally, and I see that very quickly that groupthink, that partisan groupthink starts kicking in. And I think this is hopefully something that the technology could play a role in, where you can actually remind the parties themselves that this is something unhelpful, that diversity has to be aired. Yes? So I think these graphs are not, by the way, accurate percentages. That wasn't the purpose of these graphs. But I think psychologically speaking, you can speak of three kinds of voters. The first one is the convicted and rusted on voter. And of course, in Australia, you'd have three parties with rusted on voters. Certainly Liberal Labour, and you'd have the Greens with rusted on voters, I suspect. Right? People who would vote for the Greens whatever happened. If they were in a coma for 4 years and they woke up, they'd still vote for the Greens, even if they didn't know what happened. Right? It's a leap of faith, and that's my tribe. Right? We're back at tribalism. Then there is the mainstream party swinger. I count myself in that category. I've chosen to not be part of a tribe because I want to make up my mind every single time. But I think I'm a minority. Right? That would be, I put in 4% here, but it's probably not 4%, I suspect. We should probably do that research one day. The other is, of course, the disgruntled and rusted off, to use Gabrielle Chan's book title, the rusted off voter. Again, this is not an accurate figure or a quadrant, but it's this idea of voters who feel like, if you ask them, where are you, what do you vote for? I'm thinking of Clive Palmer, I'm thinking of One Nation, right? What are these people often saying is, I didn't leave my old party, but my old party left me. I don't feel at home there anymore. But then what happens is they become part of a clearer message that can be clearer on the left or clearer on the right. Right? So they become part of that move to minor parties. And if we talk about minor parties, we'll often talk about minor parties on the alt right or the alt left. Or perhaps that's too harsh a label. Yes? So how can I sort of convert this back to sort of technology and trying to find better ways? I think one thing to remember is that tribalism is a necessary evil in some ways. Right? We can talk about tribalism as a problem because it leads to groupthink and to partisan groupthink, which is something to be fighting tooth and nail, as I said earlier. But of course, it's also something that we need to bring about social change. Social change would not have taken place in Western societies had it not been for social movements that rose to prominence and started rallying for their cause. And that would have gone hand in hand with a high degree of tribalism and perhaps temporarily forgetting nuance and becoming somewhat toxic and aggressive. But it can be a problem if we want to really have genuine reform in a more incremental way and not through barricades and contentious politics, as we call it. It can bring out the worst in people, of course. Right? Just look on social media, what we see there every minute of the day, it's terrible. You know, I crave some sort of censoring sometimes about what people are seem to get away with online. And of course, it's the tribalism that is very much inside there. And it encourages that black and white thinking, right? That psychologically you're distant. If you put those same people in a room physically, they'd probably get on quite well, right? But by the digital distance, allows us to do all these vile things that we wouldn't dream of doing if we were sitting next to them on the bus, for example, right? Similar research you can find, for example, in road behavior. You put people in a car, they become monsters, right? They engage in road rage, and they're the nicest people if you get them out of the car, and if they met the person they just abused, they'd hit it off quite well, right? But it's that shell that is around them that changes their behavior. Right. So let me try and wrap up. I realize that the connections may be a bit loose with what most of you are talking about, but I hope it's nonetheless sparking some kind of ideas and some discussion material. The first thing I think to remember, and this is where I'm happy to play the devil's advocate a little bit, but acknowledging that you need to thrust forward, is let's not be naive. The idea that technology will finally fix problems and democracy and electoral systems and policy making is old. It comes and goes, and it's never been done successful. So good luck, right? And let's keep trying. I can see how technology might be part of the solution, because at the end of the day, I'm not an expert, but I was speaking to somebody who's a professor of robotics and artificial intelligence just a couple of days ago, and it made me realize how little I know about IT and technology, and what might possible in terms of artificial intelligence learning, and even learning about values. And so I'm happy to be educated in that regard and to be curious. But there was also lessons for campaigning, for party campaigning, and I've already started using some of this in my advising to politicians who are interested. One thing, quite interestingly, I think, is that money is overrated. Right? How much talk has there been the last few weeks about this is going to benefit pensioners or cut, or hit the hip pocket of the pensioners or whatever category it is? I would think that's 80–90% of the time I hear something on TV, it's about monetary stuff. Right? Who's going to lose out when Labour comes to power or when the coalition stays in power? And all the research I and my colleagues have done in political psychology suggests that financial considerations really, really come very low on the rank of voters. Tribalism. I can't give you an exact figure, but say 75–80% is tribal belonging that drives the vote. Not that, oh, suddenly I know that I'm going to lose $120 a month. I'm suddenly going to vote for the other party. It's simply not how that works, right? And yet politicians seem to be advised or continue along those lines. But there's also lessons for democratic reforms. I'm a bit sketchy myself, I have to admit. But my sense is that these tribal instincts should be acknowledged. They should be understood. You can learn about it in the political psychology literature. And I think the advice I would have for anyone thinking about new systems is to say, rather than to leave it unmanaged or leave it a chance where things will become toxic, it will slide into some kind of online mudslinging match, it's best to actually bring it to the fore explicitly and do something with it. And actually, whilst you're working on nuts and bolts in a technical sense, to also have ideas about how you manage the tribalism in a positive way and as a source for good. Yeah? And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Did you want to ask your question? Depoliticize.
Yes. How would that be? Yes, well, that's a good question.
It's not possible.
It's not possible.
It's like
you're absolutely
right.
Right.
Give up breathing.
Say
it's like getting people to give up breathing.
Yeah, that's right.
You know.
That's right, yeah. And it's for us political scientists, it's almost more amazing that people thought they could do it than the discovery that they couldn't do it, if that makes sense, right?
Well, people who spend a lot of time in their minds without testing it in the crucial reality come up with things like, well, you can raise a boy as a girl and it will work.
Yeah.
And that proved to be a total
Yes, that's right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think there's a whole discussion about academic research and so forth as well, about how that operates. And sometimes we can call it amnesia in research, right? Where I've literally been in situations where I stuck my hand up in an audience and said, actually what you're arguing has already been argued by somebody else or proven inaccurate by somebody else. And literally person would just gloss over it, and a year later I read the publication, there's no mention of that work in it. So that's purpose forgetfulness, because we're under pressure to publish and to say smart things, right? So we can talk about that. It's probably taking us off the kind of topic, but I'd love to talk to you more about it.
It's cool.
Right, yes, I suspect that's true too. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Great, thank you, Frank. I think you'd all agree that was really great. It's some fantastic information and knowledge that you have there, Frank, and we're very pleased to have you with us. Also very pleased to have with us Dr. Lyn Carson from the New Democracy Foundation. And Carson and I have, shared a stage a few times, never like this, but it's quite an honour.
Sometimes it's almost as chaotic.
Yes, yeah, well, I don't think we can beat the chaos of tonight for a little while. Yeah, well, we're going to just have to do our best. So, you did say, you asked your question was about how do you depoliticize. The first thing that came to my head was citizen juries, randomly selecting. Well, let's listen to what Professor Carson has, because she's one of the foremost experts in this area. So, Carson, over to you.
Thanks, Dion. Thanks for inviting me. Apparently there are some people there, although I think it's just you. That's all I can see.
There's 3 of us.
There's literally dozens of us. The speakers anyway. So hello. A quality crowd, I would suggest, if not the quantity. I'm with New Democracy. New Democracy is a research foundation. Thankfully, I'm no longer with the university, so I can say what I like, and I'm not required to do peer-reviewed publications anymore. I think if you have an interest in this work, I would really direct you to the New Democracy website. And if you look under research, you'll find a collection of R&D notes that probably tell you a whole lot more than I'm going to be able to tell you in the short time that I have with you. Let me start by saying that we work with jury-like processes, as Dion said, citizens' juries, but also citizens' assemblies and similar. And there are some principles that we adhere to. We like to bring together a diversity of viewpoints, and we do that through random selection. So we have civic lotteries. It's like a criminal jury, except we overcome the weaknesses of a criminal jury. And people come together and they deliberate. They deliberate for long periods of time, 40 hours, maybe over 5 days. They are not sharing opinions only. They are working together in a way that's able to really make the most of their collective intelligence. They make recommendations that go to a decision maker. So there are some real contrasts here between the sorts of things that you've been talking about, that is online direct democracy, and what I'm talking about, which is deliberative democracy. Direct democracy is a collection usually of opinions. It isn't typically subjected to critical thinking and a recognition of biases. And a deliberative method is about public judgment. It's about pooling that collective intelligence. It's about doing critical thinking, hearing from experts, and arriving at a judgment that everyone can agree with. It's very lengthy. It's not quick, as you get with direct democracy. It's extremely influential. So we only do projects if we have in advance guaranteed influence by the decision maker that they will act on the recommendation. So let me just give you a couple of examples. We're part of an international network called Democracy R&D, which has something like 26 organisations in 15 countries doing extraordinary work. One of the most recent successes was in German-speaking Belgium, where a randomly selected parliament, or a people's council, has now been convened that runs alongside the parliament. So it's almost like a third tier of parliament that is a civic lottery. And those people are able to convene citizens' assemblies on issues that they regard as important. We've just done a project in Byron Bay where the people were randomly selected, and they have developed a model for democracy based on what they believe should be happening at a local government level. We did something similar in Geelong, where the people of Geelong, 100 people, came together and made a decision about how they wanted to be governed at a local government level again. In Madrid, there is a very nice combination of the kind of direct democracy that Dion was talking about, where people do go online, they offer ideas, opinions, and then it's subjected to scrutiny by a deliberative group, again, a civic lottery of people who then look at the material that has come in online and spend the time that I think is needed in order to work out whether or not that should be proceeded with or should go to a referendum. I'm very happy to take questions. There's lots of great stuff going on in the world. I don't think what we are doing is experimental anymore. I think it's happening. It's happening far more widely than I think you could possibly imagine. And when you are part of an international network, as I am, I'm surprised every day by the kind of democratic innovation that is going on in some very unlikely places like Mongolia and Mexico. We tend to hear of the disasters in news, but we don't hear of the incredible successes that are going on either at a local, state, or sometimes a national level, as has happened in Ireland. That's as much as I wanted to say. I know that you wanted me to be very quick. I hope I was quick enough. And I can't hear questions, so it's probably no point at all in you asking me a question. But maybe you could ask Dion a question, and then he can tell me.
Here we go.
That sounds really interesting. I've never heard of deliberative democracy before. Could you just talk us through like a really simple example of how it works, like mechanically?
Sure. And it's a terrible phrase, isn't it, deliberative democracy? I've always thought no one is going to take to the streets saying, what do we want, deliberative democracy, when do we want it now? But interestingly, in the UK, that's exactly what's happening. People are taking to the streets saying, what do we want, a citizens' assembly, when do we want it now? And so maybe that's a very good example to offer you. Extinction Rebellion, for example, is demanding a citizens' assembly on climate change. And the model that they want to use is very similar to the model that we used in Australia. In fact, the Irish citizens' assemblies were somewhat modelled on our own experiment here. So let me tell you what we did in Australia. We had an Australian Citizens' Parliament. We randomly selected 150 people, one from every electorate in Australia. We convened regional meetings and went to talk to them about what they would encounter in Canberra, Old Parliament House. And those 150 people came together over 4 days. They deliberated on how to strengthen Australia's political system to serve us better. They heard from expert speakers. It's a very important part of our process. They were able to interrogate that expert knowledge. They work together in small groups. It's not a big plenary of, it's not an audience with people talking at them. Once they've heard that expert knowledge, they have opportunities to talk together. They have opportunities to question those experts. And then they have to agree on the recommendations that go forward to decision makers. Unfortunately, our particular project happened on the same weekend of Black Saturday in Victoria, and you probably remember the media coverage that ensued over that particular event quite rightly, but it meant that the Australian Citizens' Parliament was not covered particularly well. It has been documented. It was a huge research project, and there is a book on it, The Australian Citizens' Parliament and the Future of Deliberative Democracy, that would give you real insight into one case study. It has been followed up in Ireland. You probably are aware that the country that gave us marriage equality for the first time at a national level did that as a consequence of a citizens' assembly. So there was a deliberative experiment, and then certain issues were put to referenda. The abortion legislation was put to a referendum, as was marriage equality. So Ireland represents a really nice combination of deliberative democracy coupled with direct democracy in the form of a referendum afterwards. They also had, they've done some really nice work on climate change as well in Ireland, and it won't surprise any of you to hear that the recommendations included the kind of price on carbon that Australia has been very quick to avoid and argue about for many, many years now. So I have great confidence in people if they are brought together with a diversity of views. It's counterintuitive, but you actually want people to have very diverse levels of education, experience, and so on, and together they will make fantastic recommendations. They have never failed me, and I've been involved in dozens of citizens' juries and other forms to date.
Thank you, Lyn. That is fantastic, and I'm sure everybody can tell that that's just a little segment of Carson's projects and really knowledge of this area. So have a look online for something else by Carson. You can also see there's a little video that of that 150 members, the citizen jury for all of Australia. It's worth watching, it's only, a few minutes of your time. I think we have to cut the question because we've got so many people. One simple question. Well, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Did you hear the question?
No, what was the question?
Do citizens get paid to participate in these?
New Democracy always provides an honorarium. It's not a great amount of money, but I think it is important to acknowledge that you value the contribution that's made by people who give quite a lot of their time, and they're very, very dedicated. I think the question is something about people don't have the time to do it, and the joy of a citizens jury is that they are one-off. It's not 5, Monday to Friday. It's usually held over a number of weekends. We tend to do one day on a weekend, maybe over a matter of months. So it might be 40 hours, but it's over a period of time that works for people's very busy schedules.
Can I ask a very, very quick question, sort of to follow up on that, but in a different direction? As you've been explaining this, it's fascinating. I think it's a really interesting and very powerful mechanism, but potentially more as a lobbying mechanism than a form of decision-making itself. Is it imperative that the condition precedent for this process is that it's guaranteed to be considered or guaranteed to be adopted? We don't use it at all as a lobbying mechanism, and we only work with government because we wanted to make a difference. People are just so sick of being consulted and nothing happens. So it's really important for us that whatever we bring these people together to discuss is actually going to make a difference. It's going to have real influence. And that varies, that degree of influence will vary. But in Byron, for example, this model of democracy, they guaranteed in advance that they would trial it for 2 years. So they're about to do that. After 2 years, they might decide that those recommendations are not particularly the right ones for Byron, or maybe they are. But at least they guaranteed in advance that they would do it, which meant that those citizens took it extremely seriously because they knew the impact of that decision on the entire community.
All right, perfect. That was lovely. Thank you for coming along, Carson. And I hope you're
still good luck.
Enjoying the rest of the show from home. All right. Next, we're going to actually go to sort of our running sheet. Oh yeah, give Carson a clap even. Yeah. We're going to go back to the running sheet. So Tim, you're up next. You happy? Happy to come up? Yep. This is exciting. All right. So everybody, please welcome Tim. He'll introduce himself.
Thanks. I'm Tim. I work for the Thor project at the moment, which is a non-profit that makes internet privacy software. I've also had some experience in data privacy and reporting. Oh, that's not me. And I've also been campaigning a bit with the Greens and on marriage equality and for digital rights. So I have a bit of volunteer background in politics as well. I'm going to talk about I'm going to start by talking about some research I did last year. I had a look at the ACT's electronic voting system, and there are a number of states and territories around Australia who've tried electronic voting. Some of them, like the ACT, have been doing it for, I think it's almost 20 years now. And but when I had a look at their system, I worked out that they could, anybody with access to the amount of data that they were collecting could actually work out how a significant number of people had voted. And this is the problem with complex systems that collect a whole bunch of data, is that in this case, they collected the time that everybody was marked off the roll and the time that everybody voted. And so if you can imagine when the polling booth is quiet, that lets you line up those times and work out how people have voted. And this is a serious failure that happened over a number of elections. Not quite as serious as somebody being able to modify the vote, but still, knowing how people voted is a big deal. and it's actually quite illegal in the ACT. There is a specific piece of legislation that says, no, you can't approve a voting system, an electronic voting system in the ACT that lets you find out how people voted. But yeah, they still went ahead and didn't actually, so there are a number of failures in that process. One of the failures was that they changed the system without reviewing it. So they added the electronic roll marking but didn't do a security review of the whole system. And one of the other failures is the original security review that they had didn't actually look into whether you could find out how somebody had voted or not. But there are some, this is actually quite a common thing that happens with electronic voting across Australia and around the world. I don't know if any of you have seen recently the Swiss e-voting. A bunch of researchers, including some researchers from the University of Melbourne, discovered that it was actually possible to change the result of the vote in Switzerland. And similar problems have been found by the systems that are used in the systems that are used in New South Wales and a bunch of other states in the US. I'm going to take a step back from those details and talk about some of the things that we can do for any electronic voting system. We need to give experts and political parties more access to how these systems work. So that means making the systems open source and allowing scrutiny of how the systems actually work. There's a big difference between being able to stand in a polling booth as the votes are counted and watch the result of the counting of every vote and just seeing the count at the end that an electronic system produces. We need to be able to see the steps that are taken, and we need to be able to verify that the steps that the software is taking are the steps that it was designed to take. One of the researchers in this area, one of the things that they've suggested is a voter-verified paper ballot. That is, if you're going to do electronic voting, there needs to be a paper copy of that vote in case the system crashes, the data is corrupted, there is a paper vote to go back to. The advantage of having a separate paper copy is that you can also do what's called a risk limiting audit, where you count a small number of the votes depending on the margin, and you say, well, we want to be 99% sure that we got the vote right, and there's a statistical calculation that tells you how many random votes you need to count in order to be 99% sure, and that depends on the margin. In a close election, you might need to count all of them. In an election with a huge margin, you might only need to count a few thousand votes to be sure of the result. One thing that we can also do across government and companies is to develop a security culture. In the ACT, I couldn't even find out who the vendor of the roll marking system was. I was surprised I could find out that it was collecting timing data. And that's not okay. And the kind of response that people get when they report security issues is often threats or being ignored or being told that they've done the wrong thing, rather than saying, thank you for your help and we want to work with you to make sure that we don't make this mistake again. We need to have systems that are much more open. I also want to just quickly talk about two other things that are sort of related to these kind of data issues. One is computerized campaigning, probably made the most famous by Clive Palmer and all of the text messages that are being sent out to people. But a bunch of political parties, well, all political parties in Australia have access to the electoral roll, and many of those parties use that in order to have conversations with people and collect information so that they can effectively have volunteers or political party staffers continue that conversation on. The problem with collecting so much data is that most of these systems are not very well secured. And so you run the risk of a breach, you run the risk of people being manipulated on the basis of the data that's been collected about their political opinions. There are a whole bunch of pretty terrible risks that are involved there. Some of the harshest historical political regimes have collected statistical information about people and then misused it to target those people. And we need to be very careful that we're not enabling that kind of culture. There are some potential solutions to that. Part of that is building systems, again, that are open source, that have basic security in them, including a sensible choice of only letting a few people access all of the information in the system. Another is to build networks rather than just a big database with everybody's personal information in it. So instead you have organizations that are campaigning on smaller issues or in local areas that maybe communicate and share a little bit of information but don't share the sheer volume of information they know about people. You can take that decentralization even further and have people connect through relationships rather than through a big database that contains everything you've ever said to the party or the organization, which actually tends to be more personal and effective. Like Lyn was talking about, it's important that people actually spend time to have a good conversation and to get to know each other and to have a conversation about the issues rather than just spamming people with text messages. Yeah, I just also want to talk about, quickly talk about mass surveillance in terms of there are other companies and organizations and governments that do collect large amounts of information about people on an even broader scale than political parties or election voting. And we need to be careful of the effect that that has on people. If people know that their conversations on Facebook or Twitter or with political representatives are all being monitored and collected, that changes what they're willing to say, and that changes the kinds of things, interactions they're willing to have with people. But it also leads to a bunch of the other threats I was talking about in terms of manipulating people or releasing some of their personal conversations publicly that they didn't intend to have. Advertising companies are particularly bad at this, where they collect information about people just to sell them stuff, even though that information can be terribly personal, like people's health or their political preferences or the organizations they're involved in. There are some solutions to this for the kinds of forums and discussions we're talking about. It's important to restrict what is available publicly and make sure that people actually consent to having their information published. It's not enough to anonymize data. There's a bunch of really good research that some researchers in Australia and around the world have done, where they've shown that even if you take somebody's name off, say, a census, if you have all that information, you can work out who that person is. We can, as I was talking about before, we can decentralize our communication and not run them through huge databases like effectively Facebook or Twitter, but use more secure apps where people can have smaller conversations, where fewer people have access to the information. And we can be careful how we use these platforms, because there is the threat of people being blocked or taken off the platform, or the platform itself not functioning the way that the community needs it to work. A lot of these platforms are designed to sell ads or to encourage conflict, to get people looking at more ads rather than to encourage people working together. And again, with encouraging conflict, if we are going to use platforms that encourage conflict, we need to make sure they're well moderated, which often means a whole bunch of volunteer time looking at all of the posts and making sure that people feel comfortable enough to have conversations in that community. That's about all that I had to say. I just wanted to run over some of the issues with technology that I run into in my work, but I'm happy for people to ask questions and then to talk a bit more about any of those things. Do you want them? Yeah.
was excellent. Cool. Thank you. Great privilege of a shuffled run sheet for this evening, as I've now got the opportunity to have watched a couple of people and springboard on a couple of their presentations in the course of me making my presentation. My name's Angus Murray, and I'm a Vice President of the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties. I've been asked here tonight by Miles, and I thank Miles and the Pirate Party, I suppose, for extending the invitation. Everyone who's here, everyone who's online, I thank you all as well. This is a very important discussion to be having. And for my previous speakers, I thank them as well. I apologise, I have a little bit of a cold, so if I'm nasally on the recording, we can blame the technology. And I'll start with the way that this entire evening started, because I think that's quite important. It's recognising the traditional owners of this land, custodians and First Nations people, and their leaders past, present and emerging. We're talking about modern democracy, but losing modern democracy to past traditions and the lessons learnt from past traditions is an extremely dangerous thing to do. From my perspective, I come at this with a number of different organisations, a lot of those technology and digital rights focused, all of them rooted in human rights and civil liberties. There being a subtle but important difference between the two. I won't draw that difference tonight because it's about democracy. What I think is a useful thing to start for me is where the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties came from and what that means to Queenslanders and Australians generally. I found this out in the course of researching where Jim Kelly came from as the first president of the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties and where the actual true genesis of Queensland's Council for Civil Liberties stems from. And that's 1936 with the Australian Council for Civil Liberties as a chapter of that organisation. QCCL was then formed in 1967 as a separate chapter, and in true and proper civil society and civil liberties constructs of discourse between citizen and government, QCCL had a couple of false starts with disruption to the first meeting, second meeting, a couple of things between those two meetings, and then finally emerging as an organisation in October 1967. The Queensland Council for Civil Liberties has had a very rich history in the interaction between government and citizen, and although that doesn't sound like it's particularly rooted in the discussion we're having tonight, I think it's fundamentally important to the discussion we're having tonight. In the course of researching Jim Kelly, his booklet in 1967 about citizens and the police is quite interesting. It's the discourse that exists between citizens and police and the way to deal with arrest warrants, allegations and criminal prosecutions brought by the Queensland Police Service. It was revisited in 1982 by the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties, and themes as a, in my view, good way of recognising the work that the Council for Civil Liberties has done over the last 50 years, and longer if we put it back to 1936. QCCL has been responsible for a number of significant changes in Queensland's political landscape. As an advocate and activist body for Queenslanders, promoting and protecting Queenslanders and all Australians' civil liberties by engaging in protest, by engaging in discourse with government, and by standing up for Queenslanders when there are situations occurring that shouldn't be occurring. Unfortunately, history is the best place to draw all lessons from, and unfortunately those lessons need to be repeated, it seems, many times before they're properly taught. What we see now today in modern democracy ties into the shift that's occurred in the discourse between citizen and state in a civil libertarian context, being the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties context. Where in the past Queensland has experienced things like the Fitzgerald inquiry and the Joh Bjelke-Petersen era, and earlier than that, we've had UQ mentioned here tonight. There was an earlier inquiry before the Fitzgerald inquiry where UQ students were protesting tertiary education costs, and the police decided that it was a particularly wise idea to take batons to students, particularly a female student, that ended up with a public protest and outcry. It's those places where people form beliefs, views, and have the ability to exchange beliefs and views to come to some form of meaningful discourse upon which they express to the public generally, that then ends up before the Parliament. Those places are universities. Those places are places where ideas are exchanged by people who have an interest in such ideas, and that is an aspect of our modern democracy that has been seriously tarnished. There is a focus shift that has occurred in the way that our democratic society operates that doesn't value that anymore. And I respectfully put to the people here and the people watching that we form a part of an elect ourselves. We are the elected people that are having this conversation, and it is diminished. That is something that needs to change in democracy. And this may be, as many of the speakers before me have mentioned, for a variety of reasons that deal with the apathy, disconnect, disillusion, inability to directly involve oneself, or the, as Dr. Lyn Carson said very eloquently, the enjoyment people get out of being involved in the political process. It's the detachment from the ability to do that. Unfortunately, from the Queensland Council of Civil Liberties perspective, QCCL's membership and interest is at its highest when civil liberties are at their lowest. That's not the way that society should organise itself. Society should organise itself on the basis that democracy is underpinned by three fundamental tenets. The first is we have an informed society, citizenship, membership, electorateship, however you wish to call the group of people who are engaging in that process, ought to be provided with the information, or at least the avenues and access to information, to be able to meaningfully involve themselves in a system without perturbance, disruption, or some form of intercourse that occurs in that acquisition of knowledge that is not transparent and kosher. And by that I mean targeted advertising for political purposes, or applying Spam Act exemptions to citizens and producing outcomes that are lawful but may not necessarily be democratically sound or appropriate. On top of that informed electorate, society, membership, however that's properly framed, there then needs to be a responsible, and then second concept, representative government formed. Part of a responsible government is the perpetuation of good democratic processes. My personal belief is that that is a big failing. That is a system that we have gone down as a consequence, and I would point this to the political lobbies and campaigns that have occurred historically, and more recently the introduction of targeted advertising and political advertising mechanisms that alter democracy. My personal view is that is a reprehensible and hopefully not irretrievable step that we've taken in the wrong direction in the terms of what is truly representative and responsible governance. The purpose of democracy is to empower people to govern a state, empowering politicians to act in what they consider to be, and without proper connection to their electorates, the best way of moving forward is a dangerous starting point to go down. It ends in situations where protests occur, it ends in situations where rights are stripped, and it ends in situations where true democracy and a concept that in theory is the most effective and most functional form of governance is swept away into something that's inappropriate and incorrect. I'm not going to talk for too long tonight because I got the opportunity of springboarding on my colleagues, and I said to Miles that I wouldn't speak for too long. Hopefully that gives a landscape from my perspective, which I equally hope is slightly different from the perspective given by my colleagues. I'm a person who always welcomes questions, because I think if there are questions, then there's discussion, and if there's discussion, then what I've said means something. But I very much thank you for the time, and if there are questions, please feel free to ask them. Someone must ask a question. I'm joking, but someone should ask a question.
I guess I have more of a comment than a question, but I found it really fascinating. The membership and interest of the QCL will be lowest when, would be highest when the observance of rights within Queensland would be lowest. Are you able to point to any recent occurrences where that was the case?
Queensland's going through an interesting stage at the moment. So one might say the introduction of our Queensland Human Rights Act is something where the observation of rights in Queensland is at its highest, therefore the rights of citizens are least affected, and membership should therefore drop. At the same time, we're having in Queensland an inquiry into surveillance devices. We've recently just had an outcome by the full bench of the Fair Work Commission in relation to biometric, the requirement of providing biometrics to an employer. In first instance, the employer had said you must do this, and it was held up by the Fair Work Commission. On appeal, it was thrown down on the basis that that was an arbitrary intrusion into privacy, amongst other things, and offended the Privacy Act and Invasion of Privacy Act in Queensland. We have an interesting discourse in Queensland at the moment because it's good, but it's bad. And that's part of the issue that's happening with the whole, I suppose it's not even Queensland, it's Australia and globally. There is so much happening at the moment with technology and the way that technology is intersecting with society that it's difficult to know where the wins and the losses are. And that's part of the charge that sits on a responsible government, is to responsibly educate their community in terms of what technology is doing and how technology might affect people. And I think, personally, we are at a very, very important juncture of change. When we're talking about introducing technology into democracy, we're talking about a fairly important process as a society and as a cohesive arrangement of people that are governing ourselves as a collective. If we start introducing technology, as Tim was very accurately pointing out, we need to understand what the technology is. It's not good enough just to have this is the technology. It's the understanding of technology and the ability to scrutinise technology that's really important. Now's not the time for blind faith or tribalism, if I adopt one of my previous speakers' connotations. Now's not the appropriate time for that. Now's the time for individually holding the charge and the baton of democracy and saying, my vote will matter because my vote is informed. If that approach is adopted ubiquitously, I think that makes a big change. It's incumbent on current members of parliament and government, whether that government changes or not in 2 weeks' time, that will be a matter for a new government or the ongoing government. It is incumbent on that government to ensure that everyone in society has the opportunity to meaningfully contribute into this process. Because that juncture will change as fast as technology changes. And I think that there's something called Moore's Law that says how fast that changes. And I think we're probably accelerating past Moore's Law.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Okay, I can smell that food now. So, do we have one more question? Just quickly.
I think my question, I'm not sure if it's a comment or a question, but I think it links my talk and your talk and the previous person talking about deliberative democracy. I think one thing we've got to be mindful of is that sometimes we talk about deliberation or deliberative democracy or systems or civil, let me put it this way. It's one thing to put people in a room and let them talk to each other about an issue, say the death penalty or abortion or whatever it may be. It's another thing to do perspective taking. And what I sense in Australia and many other Western countries, I think there's no place for perspective taking in, say, primary education. We're obsessed with counting and literacy and maybe some geography and perhaps some history of the Roman Empire, but we don't actually actively encourage people to perspective take, perhaps very indirectly. Right? If you think about teaching indigenous history, or how would it be for them, that is a form of perspective take. So my question, or perhaps comment, is, do we need to be more mindful when we talk about deliberative democracy, about reforming systems of democracy, but also your fields of civil rights and civil liberties, right? That we need to think about it in layers, as it were. Say we have the infrastructure, technology, but underneath it is the psychology of keeping tribalism at bay, and on top of that, encouraging people to put themselves in the shoe of somebody else they're not, and what would it feel like?
I'll take that as a question because I think it's an excellent. I think it is an excellent question. To put a perspective on this, a part of my practice is tax litigation. So from a tax perspective, I have a large number of clients that are very, very interested in the outcome of this election, for obvious reasons, that there are certain tax consequences that might flow from this election, or tax amendments that might flow from this election, that would be very, very meaningful for their business. From the perspective of someone who is, for example, a high school teacher, those tax considerations are not really relevant at all, or at least to the extent they're relevant, that's not within the field that person is interested in. So you're right, the perspectives in society are quite important. I think when it comes to teaching those perspectives, I come at this with a bias from the teachings that I have through a legal background, and that is critically analysing the situation, or critical reasoning in the process of electorates and the electoral process is probably the greater key than perspectives or deliberative anything. And I say that because it's very easy to get lost into noise. And I know that from civil society, as I said, people care most about their civil liberties when their civil liberties are being directly and personally affected. People care least about their civil liberties when it isn't them specifically, or them within a group of people that they're aware of and connected to being affected. The critical reasoning process is that even if it isn't me, this is something that I don't wish to have happen. And that, I think, is the step that's more important in informing an electorate in democracy. I don't think that takes away from anything about deliberative or direct democracy or any other form or mechanism of modern democracy. I think it's just a caution in terms of the way in which that's communicated to an electorate to engage the electorate in a certain position or certain process. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break now. Everyone get some food. We're going to be switching over to the second segment. And thanks a lot to all of our speakers so far. And dig in.
Okay. Andrew. If we could start making your way back to your seats, please, and let's kick off our second half. So, my name is Miles. I'm from the Pirate Party. I'm running for Senate this election. So, for this second half, we'll be getting our speakers from our various minor parties to step forward and speak a little bit about their campaigns and what they're doing in the democratic space. So this is my first time running for election, as is often the case with other minor parties. And in a lot of ways, what I'm doing is reinventing the wheel in some ways. But at the same time, we're in a really exciting time where what we're doing, everyone's reinventing the wheel. Everything has been changed with the internet, and everything is still changing because of the internet. We're no longer in the wonderful, wacky world of Web 2.0 with Zen Garden and GeoCities websites. No, that was 15 years ago. We're past Web 3.0. We're with Node and React and whatever. We're into this. We're past cloud. We're into this strange new dimension where social media is now legacy, where we've seen multiple social media giants disappear entirely with AIM and MySpace and GeoCities and the others, where websites like Facebook and Twitter are themselves in some ways starting to feel dated. And whenever there's an orientation or a training session for people who are trying to understand social media or make use of it in a professional environment, it always starts off the tagline these days that Leet Speak, for example, goes out of date within 2 weeks. That social media, it's like there's a truism about Facebook going around that because everyone's parents are now on Facebook, people of my generation, early 20s and teens, we're moving off Facebook to get away from our parents again. So that's kind of the pace that we're at in this weird sort of almost post-social media world. But the thing is, social media is now has quite thoroughly in a lot of ways supplanted legacy media such as TV and radio and print newspaper. And there's all kinds of really interesting and wacky things going on there economically in terms of disruptive industry, which Silicon Valley in the US has been heading, but at the same time, there's huge effect socially as well. So the Pirate Party, in a lot of ways, we're part of that social, but also political disruption that's been going on because of the internet. So our founding issue was copyright. It was rather the catalyzing issue because it was something that happened and it just blew up. Just overnight, it encapsulated so many different issues which so many people felt really strongly about, which was not being represented by legacy politicians or legacy media or any kind of existing social influencer. It captured something which spoke to a whole generation and kept going all the way through, pushing us into government and into the political electoral process all around the world. So we were founded in Sweden in 2008 as an international movement, and we have achieved significant electoral success throughout Europe. So currently we are in government in Czechoslovakia and briefly in Iceland. And we're still one of the majority parties in Iceland. And there's a very large pirate electoral presence in the European Union Parliament, but also Germany, France, and several other European countries. So we're not a fringe movement per se. Here in Australia, we are obviously a very minor party, but at the same time, we do have a strong political and electoral tradition, which harkens back to that idea of disruptive social processes. So we, going back to my own campaign and reinventing the wheel, in a lot of ways, it's almost like all of my campaign is social media driven. All of it is digital media driven. That I'll make posts on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and I'll set up all these kind of cool events and all these ways to promote them and push ideas out there, and that's great. But it's not just that. I've also got to back that up with actual content, with actual images, with memes, with appearances and presentations and selfies and speaking at rallies and going to rallies and photobombing. there's so many techniques which tie into that, producing content and then distributing and sharing the content. The holy grail is, of course, to go viral. Getting an image or a tweet or that sick burn at that exactly the right time, or some comment on Twitter, that retweet or subtweet that kicks in and hits at exactly the right time to go viral. That's a holy grail. And we've gotten lucky with a few of them, but in a way it's almost like businesses are trying to do the same thing. Massive corporations. And they've got huge amounts of money and very, very intelligent people, academic researchers and statisticians and data analysis, people who have got a lot more resources than us and are putting all those resources into trying to make money out of this social effect. And so now in this post-social media generation, we, in the Pirates and a lot of other political movements who are really clued in technologically, are in this vein where we've been through that process of seeing the social disruption and seeing the technological disruption and the economic disruption, and now we're at the point where, okay, massive corporations and businesses are moving in, and they're doing the same thing. They're doing the same thing that we are 10 years ago. They're doing things which we can't even imagine because the huge amounts of money and data at their disposal. So now, in some ways, we're playing catch up, and in other ways, we're looking at this and seeing, yes, this is really cool and exciting, but now we need to talk about what's next. What are the implications of what these massive corporate players and governments are doing with money and data? And more importantly, what are we doing about it? What are we doing in talking about what they're doing? What are we doing in theorizing about whether that's right or whether that's wrong? So now we've moved, us, the Pirates, and various other groups have moved into this digital rights space where we're looking at governments that are taking Facebook, taking Twitter, taking social media data, and performing massive data harvesting. Businesses are leading the way in this data harvesting and monetization, and governments are very close behind in taking that data and employing that data for all kinds of social control and social repression. So there's some really scary things happening around the world. Some of the foremost leaders in it from a governmental perspective would be the People's Republic of China and their social credit score and their massive surveillance system. Very, very scary going on there. And there are similar things happening in Australia and the UK and the US with the Five Eyes Alliance and the data sharing going on between our countries. But also what will happen is one country will bring in some form of legislation for surveillance or some kind of surveillance measure, and they'll take it just a little step further than previous legislation. Then the other countries in that Five Eyes Alliance will point to that country and say, look, they did it, therefore it's best practice in policy, therefore we should do it as well. And so what we tend to see is a Trojan horse style approach, where when a government wants to sell a form of surveillance, a process of surveillance to their electorate, they'll present it and saying, oh, but we want to have this extra tool to fight crime, organized crime. We want to have this tool to stop illegal drugs being smuggled in. We want this tool to stop pedophiles from accessing child pornography. And these are things which most of us we want to support, right? There are genuine social issues and genuine criminal issues and problems in society that we all recognize as problems that we all want to fix. But the solution which our governments want to present to us again and again and again is, according to them, more surveillance, less privacy. Let's bust crypto. Let's bust crypto. Only criminals use that, right? Are you a criminal? Are you a criminal for using crypto? No, that's fine. You don't need crypto. And there are huge repercussions for that. Most of our electorate do not understand technology issues. Most people in Australia do not understand technology issues. And so when the government can say, oh, all these big scary criminals and drug smugglers are using encryption to protect their illegal, immoral activities, we need to break that encryption. Most people go, well, okay, well, that seems okay. I don't understand crypto, but if the government says it's bad, it must be bad. So that's where groups such as us, the Pirates, and other digital rights groups like the Digital Rights Watch and Electronic Frontiers Australia and the Queensland Civil Liberties Council, where we all come in, and other minor parties as well, such as the Greens, who are doing some really good stuff in the digital rights front, come in, and we have to get out there and educate people who support us and people who don't support us as well. We need to engage with them and tell them about these issues with privacy and surveillance and let them know the problems with what the government wants to do, but also that the government itself doesn't understand what it wants to do because of the massive ongoing civil rights issues when you introduce encryption busting and surveillance laws. Most recently with the Assistance and Access Bill, which was rushed through just before Christmas under threat of a massive terrorist attack around Christmas time, which obviously didn't eventuate, and there was no threat of it eventuating, but it was used as hyperbole to push through this massive new encryption-busting law, the Assistance and Access Bill, which essentially, and people much more knowledgeable about this have spoken about it than I, but to briefly summarise, the AA Bill allowed government to compel software providers to put a backdoor into their product and then compel that software developer not to tell users about that backdoor. And what that backdoor would be used for was for security agencies to get into that software, suck out whatever data they wanted without anyone knowing, and then put it to whatever use they wanted without anyone knowing, without a warrant in some cases. And so that by itself has huge due process issues. And there's a really great story which I love to trot out about a bikini model from the Gold Coast. Some of you might have heard this one. And she had a domestic violence complaint about, I think it was about 8 or 9 years ago now, and had a restraining order filed. It was just a brief complaint. It didn't go to a court case, as I understand, and it was resolved within months. The AVO went ahead. Over the preceding 8 years, her file was accessed about 7,000 times by police officers from all over Queensland. That's just shocking. That's shocking that could have happened, that it was happening, that there was no oversight. And so what are we going to do about it? We know that when we give law enforcement the ability to access people's data without oversight, without warrant, that they're going to abuse it. There is going to be abuses. And we can talk about cultural change, and we can talk about procedural change to try and address that. But the fact remains, if that data exists and it is accessible, it will be misused, it will be abused. So we refer to troves of data like that as a honeypot, essentially, a snooper's honeypot, that even if you're collecting that data and it's fully secure and there's huge access restrictions on it, there is still a massive incentive for criminals to access that data and then misuse that data. Or even for legitimate users to access that data and then misuse that data. So I hope that was broadly covered most of our platform. I'll sort of want to finish off with a quick nod to the recent Ukrainian presidential elections. There's a gentleman named Volodymyr Zelensky, I think his name is pronounced, who challenged the incumbent, his name was Prohaska, I think, who a business magnate or some huge amount of influence over legacy media institutions such as TV, news, and radio. Very little understanding of social media. The pre-existing president, Prohaska, ran his campaign along conventional lines, and his challenger, Zelensky, ran his campaign entirely through social media. There was no interviews, no radio appearances, or TV appearances, or campaigning. It was just Instagram posts. It was videos on Instagram, occasionally a billboard. And because Zelensky understood the technology, understood the culture, he was able to win in a landslide victory against Prohaska in the election last month, the end of last month. And so I think that kind of says that there is room for new kinds of organizing. There is room for digital campaigns and digital organizing. And although I'm not suggesting that we should abandon traditional campaigning altogether, because I'm not, I don't think anyone else in Australia is, it's just recognizing and understanding new forms of culture and new methods of organizing brought about through digital means, and how we can use them and should be using them to engage with people and talk about our issues alongside campaigning. Any questions? All right, let's move on to the next speaker then. Should be Robyn, I believe.
Okay, good evening everyone. First I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where this building sits, I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people continue to play within the community. My name is Robyn Stevenson, and I'm one of 2 Senate candidates for Queensland for Climate Action, Immigration Action, Accountable Politicians. Until recently, we were known as the Online Direct Democracy Party, and that is still who we are. We are known as ODD for short, and we quite like being odd. We have only one policy, and that is to truly represent the people. Once elected, every Australian citizen will have the right to vote on every issue, and we will act according to the majority result. I'd like to start with this 5-minute video by John Ayton, and he is one of our Senate candidates for Victoria and the creator of our platform, Polyweb. This should be sound.
Well, it was working an hour ago, and we didn't change it.
So that's
Are they hearing it in the greater world where this is wrong? That's actually a good question.
There'll be a copy of that bill on the Polyweb. G'day, I'm John. I'm the Online Direct Democracy Party candidate for the Federal Division of Parks. Today I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about the Online Direct Democracy Party and our platform, Polyweb. So, the Online Direct Democracy Party, what is it? Well, it's been around for about 10 years. You may remember it from the last election and we were called Senator Online. Well, we've had a name change and a bit of a change in direction and refined the idea somewhat, and we're back again. Well, the Online Direct Democracy Party is taking a brand new approach to politics in this country. Instead of you only having a vote once every 3 years on election promises, we're going to give you a vote on absolutely every single issue that you're interested in. And what you can do is, as an issue comes live into Parliament or is created as a bill, you can go onto the Polyweb and there'll be a copy of that bill on the Polyweb, and you vote yes, no or abstain on whether you support it. Now, ODD, the Online Direct Democracy Party, is bound constitutionally to take that result straight to Parliament. So once we have your word and your consensus, we take that with us to Parliament and vote on your behalf whichever way you went. Now, we're bound to this. We don't have any party lines to toe, and we do not have any overriding executive powers that can stop us taking your majority consensus to Parliament. Now, the Polyweb, how does it work? Well, it's simply just like a application online like Facebook or Google Plus or any of those sorts of websites that you go on. You fill in a questionnaire and you submit your answers, and then those answers get sent across to us. We then analyse the results, and then we take the results straight to Parliament on your behalf. It will take you roughly 2 or 3 minutes per bill to vote. Now, there won't be a million bills on there to vote on straight away because we're going to try to do it live. As Parliament introduces a bill, we'll introduce a bill onto the Polyweb. You will then receive an email or SMS notification, depending on your preferences, and that notification will tell you to come across to the Polyweb, that there's a new bill to vote on, and you can place your vote and you will be counted. Now, why are we doing this? Well, the reason is because the current Westminster system that we live under is called a representative democracy, and it seems to have lost its way somewhat. The parties are now more interested in following their own agendas and doing their own thing and towing a party line. Now, the Online Direct Democracy Party doesn't have a party line. We just do what you want us to do. So instead of us telling you what the best policies are, you tell us. And then we take those policies, we put them into our policy developing part of the Polyweb, and the people from all around Australia and those interested in that specific policy can develop it. Now, the idea is to get more minds and people involved. The actual groups that are going to be affected by certain policies can get in there and they can discuss, they can debate, they can argue the point, they can bring evidence, they can produce reports and that kind of thing. Now, the idea is if you get a couple of us up there into seats, we will then be the voice of the people. We want to bring some balance and transparency back to Parliament in Australia and evolve politics into the 21st century. Well, wrapping up. So Odd is the party, Polyweb is the platform. The decisions and outcomes that we can develop through the Polyweb platform, the policies that we can form, the consensus that we can gather, we take that live, direct to Parliament, and we represent you, your voice, no one else's. Now, you've got a job to do, though, is you need to get on, you need to use the Polyweb, you need to apply yourself. If you spend 5 minutes on Facebook, spend 5 minutes on the Polyweb. This is your country, you can be in control, and we're going to make a difference, and it all starts here. All right, well, you get on the Polyweb, sign up for Odd, and see you on July 2nd, and thank you.
That's the old one.
Spoken and authorised by John Aiton for the Online Direct Democracy Party.
But now he's a candidate for the Senate rather than the House of Reps. Okay. That's coming up now.
Just we slide a quick question.
Okay, do we have any questions for Robyn?
All
right. We have something.
Okay. Well, climate action, immigration action, accountable politicians. This is how we will appear on the ballot sheet. Next. Our model is direct democracy. However, as our system is representative democracy, we will operate within the system to introduce elements of direct democracy. Direct democracy is a form of democracy where you, the people, decide on policy directly rather than representatives making the decisions for you. Next. We believe your voice should be heard in our democracy. Next. As we know, our politicians do not always act according to the wishes of the majority. How can they when they're paid millions to represent someone else? Next. Often they are not even acting in our best interest. Take their head in the sand attitude towards climate change as an example. Next. We believe democracy is more than just having your say. For us, it includes transparency, education, accountable politicians, truthful information giving, so that people have what they need to make informed decisions. Next. In a direct democratic system, there is a greater degree of openness and transparency between the people and their government. Discussions and debates on major issues are held in public. We want the people to have their say. Odd will hold these discussions via Polyweb. We would also invite experts to explain issues for and against. Each senator will also be responsible for making sure the people in his or her electorate are aware of their rights to participate, and will hold information evenings and supply assistance to those who might not be on the internet to have their say. Next. So at the moment, where does our education about the issues facing us come from? We have the Murdoch media, which has its own neoliberal agenda. We have our politicians who promote their party stance on issues and have an agenda of staying in power and keeping their corporate donors happy. Thankfully, we also have independent media and social media, which goes some way towards levelling the playing field. Next. Government and mainstream media tell us what they want us to hear. This gives us the illusion of knowledge. Next. Very often they tell us outright lies. Remember the flood of boats we were going to have when the Medivac bill was passed. Our PM reopened Christmas Island so that he could hold a press conference there, and that cost us millions of dollars. It still sits empty. Next. Odd senators will be directly accountable to the people and will sign a contract to act according to the majority. If the people oppose it, then odd oppose it. It's that simple. Next. We believe it is critical for people to be given access to truthful information. Again, we will do this mainly via Polyweb, but we also envisage information evenings to inform and facilitate debate. We will fact-check information, tell you what's really going on in Parliament, and empower you with the information you need to make an informed decision. Next. Presently, our politicians manipulate us with their cherry-picked version of the truth or outright lies. The politics of fear is rampant. They do this because they want us to believe that we need them to save us from Muslim terrorists and Sudanese gangs. Economic disaster, bringing in austerity measures such as cutting penalty rates and keeping wages low. Dole bludgers and welfare orders, penalising the vulnerable rather than fixing the employment problem. And that's just to name a few. Next. Meanwhile, they award themselves with everything they're taking away from you. Next. When we first introduced Polyweb, we gave it a test run. And these are some of the issues that we put to the people, and this is what they told us they wanted. In 2017, the people directed us to oppose exploration and expansion of GSG and fracking. The people directed us not to support the Centrelink debt system, robo-debt. Next. The people directed us to oppose any restriction on asylum seekers and immigrants based solely on religious beliefs. The people directed us to support a reduction in ex-politician entitlements and travel benefits. Next. Democracy means government by the people. We want to make that a reality. Just one senator in Parliament would show the people the power that they have and set us all on a path towards the future. We have the technology to make direct democracy work. Direct democracy has already been operating in Switzerland for at least 200 years. There are direct democratic parties springing up all over the world. Welcome to the future. Any questions? Yes?
So how many people have you got signed up at the moment on Polyweb?
We had a big break. Polyweb was put under wraps for quite a while because John Aidan, he's got a background in technology, but John Aidan has a background in technology, but he is actually a chef. And he took a big break off chefing and spent all his time and money on Polyweb until he ran out. And he had to put it under wraps and go back to work. And we've only recently just opened it up again. So I take it from that you've got a fairly small base. Yeah, small. But the results, yeah. Personally, I think that we need to get off just the internet. I think we need to grow our volunteer base. I think we need to get out into the community and talk face to face with people. My role in the party, apart from being a candidate, is I'm the Twitter admin, but I think we need to do more than that. I think we need to get out into the community.
I have to agree 100%.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. How can everybody verify the result of the online vote?
I'm not a tech person, but I noticed you before talking about open source, and John Ayton talks about that a lot, and he says it will be verifiable and people will be able to audit it, and everybody will have a record of their own voting. And, yeah, so yeah, if any questions like that are better to go to John Ayton. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
I always welcome any initiatives sort of to try and revive democracy. I had two questions that are a bit critical.
Mm-hmm.
One is about the idea of the majority tyranny, right? The
Oh,
idea
yes.
that sometimes you can canvass the majority, but it's an outcome that is affecting a small minority disproportionately, right? So
Okay.
you give every one of you, but the group that's actually affected is not necessarily very representative for the whole society. So that way, sometimes you can say that aggregative democracy isn't particularly leading to a good outcome.
That's one of the main criticisms of direct
so
democracy.
I think that sits in there somewhere, right? The idea that you can just aggregate the numbers and the parliamentarian will tell whatever the majority view is a problematic one, I think. The second one is, I thought when I first was introduced to ODD that it was an idea to depoliticize, to do things, right? Say we do what the majority wants, but immediately you get a suitcase with it with some policy ideas and that are heavily coloured politically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Climate change or climate action and refugees, which I happen to be passionate about as much as you are,
Mm-hmm.
but it is a political project suddenly, right?
So
Suddenly
you're
you
talking
lose
about the
that-
name then? Yeah.
I'm not sure whether that was the name or some of the things that ODD stands for, right?
No, that would be the name. We don't actually have any policies, so yeah, it would
But
be the name.
They
I think.
suggest that that stands for a particular policy orientation, I would imagine. Is that
No,
right?
no.
It doesn't? Okay.
No.
So these are
So-
just topic areas
Yeah,
then?
so
right.
we'll start with the first question,
okay.
the tyranny of the majority. That's where debating and information giving, it comes into play. I like to give as an example the SSM vote. It was like a few years ago, there was no way in the world that we would have thought that Australians would vote for same-sex marriage. But the thing that made the difference is the people getting out into the community, telling their stories and having the majority support the minorities. And I think that's an important thing. And also, I think we need to have a Bill of Rights in Australia. And I think that's one thing that maybe we'd like the people to get the opinion of the people on that and maybe work towards, because then you can't have legislation that's going to be discriminatory against the minority. Okay. And the second question, this is a marketing thing. We don't have any money. And like I said, we're just all online. And a couple of marketing people within our party decided that this was an attention-grabbing thing. We have 10,000 followers on Twitter, a couple of thousand on Facebook. So, there's all those people that probably know nothing about us. And so when they go into the ballot box, and we did a poll of the three most important issues that people were concerned about, and that's what we call the party. And the important bit is the descriptor we use. It's climate action, immigration action. That means the action depends on what the people want us to do. you know. And also immigration, the immigration issue and the refugee issue are actually two different issues. So, you know, there's a lot of leeway there that we could maybe have more refugees and less other sorts of immigrants, that kind of thing. You know.
Thank you very much, Robyn.
Okay.
So, Thor, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I know exactly what question you're going to ask. And and I have a feeling you were going to talk about that actually immediately up next. That's all right. It's because you're up now. Thanks, Robyn.
So is this live? Yep. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say this is a novel experience. In all the candidate debates I've been to or events during an election, this is the first time I've been standing here with a beer in my hand. I guess I better put it down. I know, free's good. So, there's often a gap between words and action. And I had better get the cart before the horse and say, my name's Thor Prohaska. I'm standing as the independent candidate for Dixon. This is the 5th time I have stood for Parliament. First time was with Uncle Clive. There's a story. I can defend myself. But now Mr. Dutton and the 8 of us are contesting the prize of the member for Dixon. Some people could shorten that, I won't. So, the gap between words and action. Oh, just before I do that, I mean, I'm noticing that wherever I go, people are acknowledging and recognising the ancestors, the Aboriginal people. Now, I'd like to go one step further. I would like to actually take, for those people who may have seen it, Alan Tyndale's 1930 map of all of the tribal boundaries of Australia. Hands up if you've seen it. Okay, good, wonderful. Now, I'd like to merge local, state and federal electorates into the electorates represented by the Aboriginal tribal boundaries. Now, those boundaries, I believe, they map to the permaculture zones of self-sufficiency. And they are our natural, logical, regional boundaries. I say the land should be sovereign in there and the people that live in there should control and manage their own affairs, but collaborate with everybody else. So I think that would go a long way to not just recognising the greatness of the past, but of bringing together all Australians to fight what's happening with the absolute destruction of our planet, with the loss of biodiversity. We have a web of life and we're losing strands in it, and that web is not going to support us anymore. We will fall through that web. I won't pick numbers, but anyway. Sorry about that little sidetrack there, but that's my way of acknowledging that the spirit of this land breathes in all of us, and we need to live it and not just talk about it. So back to the gap between words and action. Now, when I walked in here tonight, I felt that I was going to be on in the first half to do with VoteWrap, my baby. I've been nurturing this child of my mind for decades. I've been taking criticism and flack from people and going home and thinking about it and going, they were right. Let's fix it. Let's change that bit. So what I've got at the moment is something that I believe solves all of the problems, all the main problems with the current online democracy systems. Big claim, I know, but again, there's words and action. These are my words, and I plan to prove that over the next 3 years in the electorate of Dixon, because everything is ready. The last 4 times, that was just preparation. This time, we've got the software, we've got the message, we've got the interest. When I go out and speak at these various events, this time, people are coming up and talking to me, wanting to know more, wanting to volunteer, telling me that I've got a good idea. Now, that's always encouraging. So, For a living, I analyse complex systems, and maybe that was that beer. Hair of the dog. Am I allowed to do that? Yeah. Okay. Catching a train, although the car's at the station. Oops, I gave it away. Bugger. When I was on Paul Murray Sky Live pub test, I couldn't have done that. Well, I don't believe I could have. They didn't encourage me to. I actually asked the producer, wow, so does that mean I can get stuck into the champagne? And she kind of went, no, not really. So anyway, I may have just lost my train of thought there. Very briefly, VoteWrap. Look, I could show you, okay, look, go to www.votewrap.com. Now, this is a very scaled-down website. I had everything up there. I was going to go open source. But when I saw social network, or whatever it was, the Carl Zuckerberg thing, I went, I've been beating my head against a brick wall for ages. I've put in my blood, sweat and tears. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go proprietary to start with. And then once it's all up and running, I'm going to give the shares to everyone on the planet. So use the corporate model, build the system, and then hand it over to the people. So, Dixon reps, no, I didn't say that. I said votewrap.com. Okay, right, that one there. That one? Yep. And I'll just shut up for a moment. This is just a very limited representation of VoteWrap. There's more to it, and it was done some time ago. Visually, it looks different. And again, no sound. AV, it always happens. The soundtrack is the new improved anthem done by a Romany band in Tasmania with didgeridoo accompaniment. So, be nice to get the sound. Because I'm actually explaining it as well. So, we work in tech, do we? You're tech. You're tech, aren't you? I'm tech. You're tech. We've got problems. What hope does the mere mortal have? I can actually. I'll fix that problem as well, but gee, they don't want to listen to you. You know.
Yes, which moves the yes vote to 85.71%.
We will need to go back to the start and preferably maximise the screen.
Hi, my name is Thor Prohaska, and I'm the creator of the VoteWrap method. As a part of developing VoteWrap, I ran a limited trial on Facebook using the issue, "Would you like Australia's national anthem improved?" One of the key features of VoteWrap is that it uses a variable consensus level calculated from an average of how important and urgent the issue is to all the voters. For this trial, I assumed that the issue is of medium importance and medium urgency, which means the consensus level required to pass the vote is 71.25%. In the trial, the voting starts with my first vote of yes, and as I am the only voter, there is a 100% consensus. The next three votes are also yes, so we still have 100% consensus. Then the fifth vote is undecided yes, which drops the yes vote to 80%, so overall yes is still the winner. Vote 6 and 7 are yes, which moves the yes vote to 85.71%. But votes 8 and 9 are undecided yes, pushing the yes vote down to 77.78%, which is still in front. However, the 10th vote is no, which pushes the yes vote down below the consensus threshold of 70%, which means the issue overall is now undecided. Vote 11 is yes, which puts it back to a yes overall. Then vote 12 is an undecided no, which then drops the consensus again below the threshold and back into the overall undecided state. Vote 13 and 14 are undecided yes, further increasing the consensus shortfall. Votes 15 to 17 are yes, but that is not enough to put us back into an overall pass, as the consensus shortfall is a bit over 6%. Then, at vote 37, voter 35 changes their vote from no to yes. From here on, there are a mix of votes, but not enough yes votes to get back to an overall yes. So, after 54 voters have had their say, we're about 25% short of the 71.25% needed to pass this vote. I hope this simple demonstration has given you a bit more of an idea about VoteWrap. However, there is much more to VoteWrap, so if you want to find out the bigger picture, then go to the VoteWrap wiki at www.votewrap.com. I know that it looks a bit complicated, but once the VoteWrap server is up and running and everyone can use it for real, then I'm confident that pretty much everyone will get it when they use it. VoteWrap is an open source project, so if you're interested in joining the development team, then go to the VoteWrap Facebook page and send us a message. If you are just interested in VoteWrap, I would like to know when it is open for business so you can use it or just have a play, then like and follow us on Facebook and we'll keep you informed of our progress towards the launch date.
But not yet. Okay, deal. Make it 2. Okay, now we're getting into the undecided zone. Could you just quickly go back to the dixonreps.net page site? The one you were at before? Yep, that one there. Now, if we go to home... Oh, no, we're here. Sorry, the trial issue. My apologies. Yep. So if we... let's just have a look down. This is the dashboard. Sorry, I should be on here. Okay. So this is what it looks like now. It's changed. If we could scroll up. Just see where it says dashboard? I want that up. Up, higher, higher, higher. Right, yep, okay. Can you make it smaller? Well, you could go Control minus a couple of times, so it'll all fit on the screen. Oh, Control plus. Not to my knowledge, but hey, Facebook has got it on everywhere. Good, you can join the team. I need someone like you. Okay, so this is just a test. Anyone can go there. All you need to do is have a Google account and you're in, and you can have your vote on that. So no sign-ups other than a Google account. And where Miles was about to click before, there's a form. So if you could go and click there now, please. Yep. Okay, so this is just a standard Google form with some app script in it and some tricky little bits of other things. So if you just give it a slow scroll so we can sort of see as it's going past. So you put in your email address, which electorate, your name, our importance and urgency, really key. You know, because if you've got something that's really important and it's only a 51% majority, then what happens is that the 49%, they're going to fight you tooth and nail. They're going to die in a ditch over it. So if you really want to have a solid consensus on something that's important, I say you need to put the consensus level up. And we already do that in America with a super majority. So it's a similar sort of thing. But it's at the control, right at the very grassroots level. Every individual controls that consensus level because they can change the parameters in there when you get into the more detailed config, which you don't have to do. But you can. It's all under the control of the people who are doing it. So if we just slowly scroll through it, we've got 5 voting states from yes and no undecided, undecided yes, undecided no. When you first come across something, you usually want to know a bit more. You're kind of leaning towards it or leaning against it. And over time, when you get enough knowledge, then you go yes or no. So I see those 5 states as much more reflective and representative of the way people really work together. So that's why I use them here. And then we get into representation. Now, this sort of ties into what we're doing on the ground at the moment in Dixon. The basic fact is this: there is absolutely no way one parliamentarian can represent 100,000 people. It's totally impossible. So, how do we solve that problem? Well, I remember years ago thinking, well, you know, 7 people have stood, you know, 30%, 23%, 14%, 3%, 5%, whatever. Why don't those people form an electorate forum after the election, and on each piece of policy that comes across the forum, the committee, whatever you want to call its table, they vote according to the number of votes they've got. So that was kind of the start of the proxy idea. So you can offer yourself as a representative, and then, if we go back up again, just a tad, up to where the voting states were, a bit further. Okay, see, assign proxy vote to representative. This is how I solve the core problem of online voting. Because the simple fact is also that most people don't have the time, and a good percentage don't have the inclination. They just want to know things are being done right, but they don't want to get involved in the detail. And they may not have a lot of policy positions either themselves. But if they had somebody who they could trust to represent them, then they would give their proxy vote to that person. So to do this, I'm breaking up the electorate, the federal division of Dixon, into subdivisions, 25 subdivisions around the 25 polling places that we will have there on the 18th of May. So in each of those, there's a reason for the next election we're going to do something interesting with that. This is just remarkable. Instead of having a glass of water. Okay, so maybe if I put it this way, simply what we're going to do after the election, we're going to start door knocking again, and when I knock on someone's door, I'm going to be offering myself as their representative. And would they like to give me their proxy vote? And if they don't, fair enough. But I'm also going to be looking for people who want to be local community representatives. Now, they are the people, you know, like me. You know, I talk to my mechanic, I talk to my wife and she tells me to shut up and not talk politics. I talk to my next door neighbour, I talk to friends. So I've got this interest in doing this sort of stuff. How many more seconds have I got? -6 minutes. I haven't been talking for that long, have I? Your video has. Well, look, what was that guy? Samuel Clemens, what's his name? Mark Twain, that's right. Mark Twain said, if you want me to talk for an hour, I'll do it now. If you want to talk 5 minutes, give me a day to prepare. Well, I haven't prepared for this as in specifically for this, but a lot of the stuff I'm saying to you at the moment is what I'm saying in the electorate. The feedback is that it is working, and I promised I would tell you what the missing bit was, and basically it is this. Can we go to, it doesn't matter, look, oh yeah, no. Do it because other people can see it. Just go to the home page and up the top right, there is my pledge. Home. Yep. Quick. I'm not the one wasting time now. Okay, pledge, please. I've also put the link on the image. This is what I've signed, ladies and gentlemen. I have signed a pledge to legally represent the voters of Dixon. Now, the fundamental problem is this, and please bear with me because it's key to what I was going to tell you. We do not have a democracy in this country. Show me in the Constitution or in the Electoral Act where it even mentions the word democracy. All it says in the Constitution that we have a system of representative government. That could be representation from the local crime gang or the corporate mob or the squeaky wheel bunch over here. Who knows who it's going to be? Not democratically represented. It's not there. So it's not going to happen before this election, so that is why I've signed the pledge. Now, Henry Thoreau said, for every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's only one hacking at the root. Now, I say the root is that we don't live in a legal democracy. It's like having a car with the fuse removed. Our democracy seems to kind of work, but if we put that fuse of those people in Parliament legally obliged to do what we want, then all change. Political donations will no longer have any effect, because how are they going to affect them? Thanks for the $1 million, corporate ABC. We're going to use it to make our electorate great again. So, but we're not going to do what you want unless we, in this electorate, decide that that's what we want to do. So I guess that covers some of the salient points. Thank you very much, Miles. Thank you for organising this, and thank you for the free beer.
Thanks, Thor. Glad you had fun. All right.
Oh, don't I get to say any questions?
Because
Ooh,
when you say
bring
you
it
sign
on.
up to be a representative,
Yep.
you want to faithfully represent all the people, and when you say you want a representative to be your proxy, you're effectively opting out of having an opinion. At least that's how I interpret the form.
Okay, so what happens is if you're a representative who uses signed a proxy, there's two types of proxies. There's a directed proxy and an undirected proxy. Yep, okay. The gentleman down the back here.
Great. I loved it. I think it's a great initiative. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I really liked it. I was wondering, it could almost be majority tyranny, right? Your program.
Well, I do have some subtleties to add to that.
Which is the crucial point here, right? That your program is able to weigh the relevance or the importance, salience of the issue, or the importance of the. That's a big step. So that made me think: could you work together with me, and could these two platforms be merged somehow to improve each other? Or it's a technical suggestion, I guess. What's another question? The other question is: have you spoken to David Cameron and tried to sell it to?
David Cameron, as in the
3 years ago.
UK Prime Minister. Brexit. Look, I could spend 2 minutes tearing Brexit apart and how undemocratic it was, but I don't have the time.
Maybe you can answer my question.
I have. Did I meet you up at Mount Cootha? Was that you? Yes. Because.
You used to work there, and I had a meeting.
We're getting chopped. Okay, anyway, look, I've reached out to ODD, I've reached out to Flux, I've reached out to all of them. Get Up, don't even want to know about me. I'm sort of on their enemy list. And it sort of seems as soon as people step into this space, they've got a more fixed opinion about what needs to be done, and they're less open. The people I door knock, they like it.
Thank you, Thor.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I've always wanted to say this. Thank you, Ball Boys.
Our next and possibly final speaker of the night. Max, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yep. Is this audio coming through?
There's sound coming through. It's very soft, though.
Okay, so mic looks good on my end in terms of volume.
Say something.
So, yep, hello.
There
hey.
Okay, there we go.
Oh, that sounds...
All right.
Okay, cool. Sweet. Okay, so if I'm good to go... hello, everyone. So thanks for having me on tonight. As the title says, my name is Max Kaye. I'm one of the co-founders of Flux. We'll try and get through this quickly because I know we're over time already. So here we go, 9:40, that's our target. So if this works, by the way, this is a little thing that I put together like while I was waiting. Here we go. There we go. How nice is that? Okay, so I've got a little slide thing. We'll go through it. Flux is a totally new way to do democracy, or it's centered around that idea. Flux is actually in and of itself a political party. We'll talk a little bit about that, but it was created from this idea that there is a better way to do democracy, and that we had to break some of our assumptions in order to find out how that was actually going to work. So, roughly speaking, Flux, we're a political party. Coincidentally, we're also the most transparent political party in Australia. I'll talk a little bit about that, or for 20 seconds. There's a new democratic system that we've invented. As far as I know, there are a few things that are a little bit similar, but pretty much nothing is like it. We call it issue-based direct democracy. We're sort of a bit unique in that we're backed by epistemology, in the sense that we have actually gone from philosophical fundamentals as opposed to other more traditional political philosophy fundamentals. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. We've been running since 2016 and founded in 2015. So, as I mentioned, we have a pretty unique and different philosophy, different approach to how we do things. It's based on particularly modern fallibilism. There's an excellent book called The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch that if you're interested in this, you should read. And that is sort of based on the wider philosophy put forward by Karl Popper back in the 40s. This was also the basis of the modern philosophy of science. And so there's a lot of really, really good stuff in there. And I think it's a bit of a shame that all of the systems that we talk about these days don't take into account all of the advancements that we have in epistemology over the last century. Arguably, these have been the most important advancements that we've ever had in terms of understanding knowledge. So our only ideological focus is progress. There is no left-right thing that we have going on. There is no idea about various ideas are better or worse than others, except that there is a way to tell that they are better or worse. We don't make judgments particularly about the ideas. But we do make, more moral, philosophical judgments, ethical judgments about systems, the way that they work, what they're based on, how they work, what their goals are, all that sort of jazz. So, by the way, experimentation, I mentioned this philosophy of science stuff. Experimentation is not core there. Most of science does not happen in the experimentation. That's just one way to remove bad ideas. It's not the place where ideas happen, which is far more like the tea room. Where most of the hardcore science really, really goes on. So let's go. Some major differences. So by the way, this little slide deck is mostly about the differences between Flux and other systems. I presume that you're all reasonably aware of the idea of digital democracy and whatever else. So we won't talk about that. So Flux is not about the will of the people. In fact, we think that focusing on the will of the people is actively harmful in terms of when you're trying to design the next layer of democracy or the next level. And that's because when you start from this idea, oh, by the way, there might be background noise. So if that is better, I hope it is. Anyway, when you start from the idea about the will of the people, you're essentially evoking this a version of authoritarianism. And that is to say that the authority on what is the thing to do, what is the best idea, what is the right idea, comes from an idea about measuring things, measuring opinions of people. And that's not how science is done, it's not how progress is done, it's not how business is done, and I don't think it should be how democracy is done. So what we are about, and what IBDD, or issue-based direct democracy, is about, is solving problems. It's also about removing authority. And this goes back again to some things that Karl Popper said. I actually have an 8,000-word essay on my site that I link at the end if you're really keen to know more about that. A final point here coming out of our philosophy is that there is no such thing as real or true democracy. Because to say that something real is maybe here, but true democracy definitely no. Because to say that something is true democracy implies that there is no possible improvement on it, that it's objectively maximized already. And that, I think, is essentially denying progress. Whenever you claim that something is the best objectively possible, you deny that there is any improvement that could be made. And I think particularly with democratic systems, we need systems that acknowledge their flaws and actively try and self-improve. This is another feature of issue-based direct democracy. I don't talk about it here, but I have talked about it online if you search for it. So I have just a bit of an aside. This is more of a philosophical thing to talk about for anyone interested, a rhetorical thing. So if you have problems solving problems, then is there actually anything more beneficial than you can do than improving your methods? The way to think about this is that if you're bad at solving problems, then whenever you try to solve a problem, you're inefficient. And that inefficiency just stacks up and stacks up and stacks up. And so this really, I think, highlights the idea about why self-correction, why error correction, why self-improvement, all of those things are so important, and read the stuff I talked about in the previous slide. So we are a political party without policies. We have been this way from day one. There is literally nothing that we think is more important than the integrity of our system, in the same way that people might say that the integrity of the Westminster system is one of the most important things about our democracy. And so if the Governor General decided to try and instill a military dictatorship, that goes against the principles that we, take for granted these days. And that's what we want to avoid. So we have a very, very strict no policy. I mentioned this thing, but with ethics, oh no, just Control Z that. Because of the small slide thing, I can't actually do a presentation, so this is just in the editor. So the ethics I'll talk about there, and also our main competition is the Westminster system as opposed to other parties, at least in the long run. So one of the things in terms of our philosophy, so we have a philosophy white paper. This is a 10-page document. I'm actually about to show a brief website shot, so let me just bring that over. So this is the website. If you go and have a look at it, much appreciated. You can see the URL, voteflux.org. So pretty easy to find. Down here, we've got candidate stuff, little intro video, but then philosophy white paper, that's been up there for some years now. Please have a read if you're interested. That is sort of lays out a lot of the foundations that we have and why we do what we do in the way that we do it. In a more philosophical level. Also, while we're here, we'll just have a look in terms of transparency. So we have live stats on membership by states. We have one of the things I'm actually quite proud of is the fact that we're basically 50-50 for millennials, which is really nice. Memberships by states. We also have revocations. So how many members have actually left the party, which is nice. We have graphs of donations, of all the donations since about late 2017, and you can see an actual thing of the exact times and things like that of all the donations we have in the system. This is not actually 100% of them. It's mostly PayPal, but we do, as we enter other ones, they come in. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, we're going to have to go fast. So I mentioned, I wanted to add a slide about proxy party problems. So Parliament United problem, we all know what that is. That doesn't require anything. One of the other issues is just in trying these sorts of things. So representatives can never be contractually bound to vote one way or another. There's some common law going back to the late 1800s about this, where that was actually tried, and it was thrown out as non-legal. So not that the contracts are illegal, but they're non-legal. You can't even do stuff like set up economic incentives, because then under Section 44, you have various problems with the idea of being in control under like various other powers that are not for the state. So it's actually really risky trying this, because we can't do stuff like robot senators, which is a bit of a pain. Nothing would make me happier than being able to elect an app instead of electing a representative. But c'est la vie. So issue-based direct democracy, just to talk about this a little bit. So there's three primary layers. There's direct, which is always available, but I don't think many people will do it. It's largely very difficult to do effectively as an individual. There's delegation or liquid democracy. This is pretty standard as a way to remove work. It's very useful, but it's not by any means solving all our problems. And then we have this third layer of reorganization. And this is where the idea of the actual issue-based part of issue-based direct democracy occurs. The direct is just because we include everyone as part of the set. Democracy is obvious, but the reorganization is the magic. So the goal of IBDD is basically to extract the best ideas regardless of public opinion. As soon as you start factoring public opinion, which of course, you've got people participating in the system. If they don't like stuff, they'll vote against it. But the main thing here is not to treat all members of the public identically, because that has a whole host of epistemic and philosophical issues. So the method that we actually use for this is we take mechanics from both epistemology and economics. Primarily, this is around the idea of evolution and markets in each of those. And the main goal is to affect reorganization of the people participating, how they participate, and what issues they participate in. An important thing here is this is not a permanent thing. This is a once-off per issue. So this is how we get rid of authority, is that you never get to keep it. If you happen to be a deciding force in one policy, then you never get to keep that position without continuously fighting for it. So we allow voters to self-organize around issues. This is both via the reorganization/trading methodology, but then also the fact that anyone can propose an idea. Anyone can participate in an idea. Anyone can become a delegate or a representative. And that's, I think, one of the most crucial things going forward in new democratic models. one of the core mechanics we have is that proposing and voting has opportunity cost. Now, to an extent, that's the case today in terms of when you think about like tactical voting in an election or the way that horse trading happens with representatives and senators and things like that. Opportunity cost has always been involved in democracy. However, we make it very explicit and we design a system to take advantage of that. There's a phrase or a quote type thing that I came up with in the WA 2017 campaign off the cuff, which was, we make the back room the front room and everyone's invited. And that's a very general idea of what an issue-based direct democracy will look like. The other thing to mention here is issues can be reproposed indefinitely. There is no time limit. There's no like limit to the number of times. So if I put forward a bill that's like give Max $1 million tax refund every year, right, then that might get through, but is it going to stay through? And so by having that very dynamic system, you allow a much, much greater ability to focus on quality ideas and remove bad ideas, and do that while, during the election cycle. So we don't have to wait, like 3 years to remove a bad idea. We can do it immediately. And that back and forth is really the only way. It's like the political analog of debate, but actually in a way that we can use quite readily. So predictions from IBDD. So the first is that there will be more experts in policy development. That's pretty straightforward because of the delegation and the quality of policy, whatever. Higher opportunity cost for bad thinkers. So if you put forward bad ideas like consistently, you will end up essentially burning a lot of your political energy. This is like the neutral unit you can use to reorganize. So you burn a lot of that. So if you're just going to be a bad thinker and be a bad policymaker, then it's not going to work very well for you. The best strategy is basically going to be proposing the best policy. There will be some other strategies that come in here, as in like when and how you propose policy, and when you've got other parties who are strongly opposed, how that all works. But on the whole, the crux of the best strategy would proposing the best policy, and also it solves the idea of tyranny of the minority and majority, which is pretty cool. So I've got videos on this sort of stuff if you want, link at the end. Little bit about e-voting, just because we had some conversation about it earlier. So I have conjectured publicly for a number of years now that secure digital voting systems, if they are auditable, also if they're censorship resistant, and that we agree on the final result, which means like single history, they have to be online and have to use a blockchain. If you give up any one of those three properties, they either lose their onlineness, they lose their blockchainness, or you're giving up the properties for them. So it's like iVote is actually in New South Wales is hilarious. They give up censorship resistance to start with. They also give up anonymity, which I don't mention in those three things there, but they give up anonymity as well. And then they trade those two things they've given up to give up verifiability afterwards. And so it is verifiable before they do their magic vote shuffling thing, which there were recently problems found in, particularly because I think the Swiss put forward their system for audit and so on. You can Google that. But yeah, so iVote is a piece of trash. Secure voting systems are really hard to do, but they are entirely possible. They have to use a blockchain. Also Flux, etc. So fun fact about secret ballot, just because it's fun. So this is something I invented actually, called Copperfield. We have a digital secret ballot algorithm. This only uses battle-tested cryptography that's been known for many, many years, which is nice. It's not vulnerable to the sort of timing attacks mentioned re the ACT system earlier. It allows for fully public voting records without revealing voter identities. The caveat there is the electoral onboarding system where people actually validate their identity is not something we've solved for. So that's like, handled off the side. You get like, a big third-party entity to audit that. But all the voting is auditable, which is really nice. So Flux, journey forward, roughly, the goal. So get elected, build the IBDD system. These two things happen in parallel. Win more seats, obviously, improve IBDD, form government, and eventually change the constitution to something that's actually decent and doesn't talk for a third of the bloody document about the pay rates of judges and whatever else. Anyway, so it's only going to take 40 years, but it's fun. So anyway, in terms of links, we're very close to wrapping up. I don't think we'll probably have time for questions, but in terms of links, these are the links to go to. We've got the Case for Flux is a really good video if you want to go more detail with all of this sort of stuff. We've got a GitHub. We have a live stream on Q&A on Facebook tomorrow night, so tune into that if you want to, or you have questions. And then there's some stuff from me as well. But otherwise, thank you very much. I only went 5 minutes over time. Oh, gosh. Anyway, Much appreciated, guys. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for talking. So I think we can have a couple of quick questions. We've got a mic flowing around up the back.
Oh, cool. Hey, Max. I've just got a question about how you reconcile, because it seems like Flux Party has two parts. It's like the technical part, which you're like super passionate about and doing some really cool stuff, but then there's also the political party side of like organizing, getting people involved and everything. Like, how do you balance the two sides to Flux?
So yeah, one thing that we've found a lot of, I'm just going to take this off while I talk because of echo. One thing we've found a lot of difficulty with is getting tech volunteers that are like high quality coders is really difficult. So I've actually done most of the coding that we've done. So we've got a whole bunch of stuff up here. For example, the one I wanted to mention here, which I haven't had enough time to work on recently as I want, but is voting alpha. This is actually an AWS stack that will set up a mostly secure voting stack, just like with a one-click thing, which is super nice. So the difficulty, or what we wanted to do plans started late 2015, was to make a startup that was doing the voting tech. And that way we would have access to like venture capital, and we could funnel the venture capital into the political party and just take it, like, win entire government into elections sort of thing. Obviously that didn't work so well. So the startup's currently on hiatus because we've run out of money. I was the principal backer, by the way, so, grain of salt type stuff. We didn't end up ever raising huge amounts of VC. It was one of the big reasons that Flux was able to work as well as it could in the federal election 2016, so that was nice. But realistically, it hasn't. The whole, tech party side has been really difficult to manage. That separation still exists to some degree, though more of the tech is being brought into the party. That's all up on a GitHub, but it's really the bottleneck is coders, essentially. It's really hard to find people who have the skills necessary to be able to design something or implement something this complex and that needs to be super robust, and do so for free. This is a $2-3 million project if you were paying people. So yeah, it's a bit difficult.
Okay, I think, Tim, did you have any comments? No. Okay. All right. Well, I think we'll call it there. Thanks a lot for calling in, Max. Where are you speaking from tonight?
So Sydney, my house. So that's nice at least.
Awesome. Nice and comfy. All right. Have a good night, mate.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Okay, well, I think we're about wrapping up. Thanks so much to everyone who came along tonight and everyone who spoke. Does anyone have any final words they'd like to quickly put out there? Excellent. All right. Excellent. Is there a mic? Pink error. The chair recognizes Dr. Frank Moll.
Yeah. Look, I learned a lot. I'm not a technical person at all, and it's always nice to be in venues where people from a very different kind of professional background and what animates them, right? It's always really good to open the windows and expose yourself to that, because too often we're locking ourselves up in very like-minded people or people who do the same research, and we use our jargon and we get on with it. So I thank you for your contributions. That being said, I think as a bit of an outsider here, you see different things as well. I think you see people getting very passionate about technological things you can do, and in the process kind of forgetting very humane things. And that was, I hope, that where I could help a little bit by saying we're ultimately still people, right? We're still social beings that are intimately attached to groups and group belonging, and the kind of segregation that we want to aspire, because the moment you talk about democracy of sorts, you talk about aggregating numbers and what people think and trying to do that in an equitable way and in a meaningful way. But how do you deal with people's attachments? How do you attach, especially when it comes to values, right? Because the last speaker did a very impressive talk, I thought, about epistemology and going from Popper's hard sciences, natural sciences, inquisition and experimentation and progress through getting a winner, right? So what you get is the progress is built on a naturalistic sense of science, that you have a winner and a loser, and you work with the winner, you get progress, you get efficiency, and so forth. And you can call that apolitical. You can say, oh, we don't do political, right? We have a naturalistic way of getting to the best outcome. In my view, that's a bit naive, and I don't mean it disrespectfully, but it is naive because in the social sciences we have a very different kind of truth claim thing going on, right? Where you have perspectives. People can simply arrive at a point where say, we see different, and there is no better knowledge. My knowledge is not worth more than your knowledge, right? How you argue with people who believe that windmills make them ill, people who think that there's a ghost in a swamp that makes them better, people who believe in all sorts of things, that a misharvest is the punishment of God, right? You and I might not believe that, but how do we differentiate between the knowledge that somebody like that brings in and my knowledge? How am I going to say my knowledge is worth more than yours, right? These are the ethical dimensions and the ontological and epistemological challenges that we're up against. So my word of caution is to make sure that when you, in a technological world, you're probably coming from a world where you're used to a naturalistic sense of truth claims, and this philosophy of science is a naturalistic one. You have to be mindful that there's another epistemology of the social sciences where you have to deal with uncertainty, with perspectives, with different perspectives that can't be sorted out in terms of hierarchy. Now, interestingly, in the natural sciences, they're coming to that realization as well. Think of quantum physics. In quantum physics, since a number of years, people know that the particle is not necessarily one spot. I can't explain it to you. You understand it far better than I do, I suspect, right? That is a really interesting point for the natural sciences, where suddenly the natural sciences have to deal with uncertainty of a sort that we as social scientists have been dealing with for many decades, what am I saying, centuries. So suddenly the STEM scientists are interested in how the philosophers and the social sciences have dealt with uncertainty, right? So I think there's much more to be explored there in order to avoid a sort of naive, technological, naturalistic worldview. We're going to fix this with numbers and aggregation, because then what you forget is the precise point I was trying to make, perhaps not very well in my talk, that it's ultimately about humans, about values, and how do you deal with that? So we're caught here in a world of trying to do our best to get a good outcome, to make progress. We don't want to immediately say, well, then it's useless, right? What are we even trying? But I think we have to do it in a way that is actually a bit more thoughtful about these two epistemological worlds that we both have to be attentive to. Sorry, that was a very long question. More a mini talk. Sorry about that.
I'm going to take that as a comment, not a question.
Sure.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. So we're going to call it here.